She should have walked past him. That's what every rational instinct screamed at Talia Mercer when she found the unconscious man bleeding into the snow outside the pharmacy on Ashland Avenue. A man with a face carved from controlled violence, hands wrapped in leather gloves stained dark at the knuckles, and a pulse so faint she almost missed it entirely. She should have called 911 and kept moving. Instead, she grabbed his collar, dug her heels into 3 inches of ice, and dragged a dying stranger through the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in 30 years. That one decision would unravel everything she had spent her entire life building, and it would begin the moment he opened his eyes. The night Talia Mercer dragged a dying man off the street was the same night she had lost her first patient in 6 months, room 4. C. Marcus Webb, 53, construction foreman, 4 kids whose photographs he kept folded inside the breast pocket of his hospital gown like currency against death. She had fought for him for 11 hours, cracked ribs from compressions, blood under her fingernails from a procedure that should have worked, statistically should have worked, and didn't. By the time she stripped off her gloves and walked out of Mercy Heights into the screaming cold of a Chicago February night, she was not a trauma nurse anymore. She was just a woman carrying weight that had nowhere left to go. The storm had been building since afternoon. By 10:15 p.m., it had stopped being weather and started being something personal. Wind came in off Lake Michigan like it had a grievance. Snow didn't fall so much as hurl itself horizontally between buildings, turning the south side streets into a whiteout corridor where the only light came from the occasional headlamps of the few cars insane enough to still be moving. Talia walked with her head down and her shoulders up and her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a coat that had never once been warm enough for actual Chicago winters, which was something she had been meaning to fix for 3 years and somehow never got around to. She was thinking about Marcus Webb's kids. She was thinking about the way the youngest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7, had been drawing crayon pictures of her father standing outside a house with a yellow door and a dog. They apparently didn't own yet, but were planning to get when he came home. She was not paying attention to Ashland Avenue, which is why she almost missed him entirely. He was against the far side of the pharmacy wall, tucked into the shallow alcove beside the service entrance, and if his coat hadn't been dark charcoal against the white of accumulated snow, she might have walked right past him in the dark. She almost did. Her foot hit the corner of the step, and she glanced sideways out of reflex, and that single glance stopped her dead in the middle of the sidewalk. Man down. Body position all wrong. Not drunk wrong, not sleeping wrong, but the specific wrong of someone whose central nervous system was losing the argument with the cold. She knew it the same way she knew a bad airway from across a room. 14 years of emergency nursing built a kind of sonar for the body shutting down, and every frequency she had was screaming. Talia crossed to him in 4 steps. Up close, she processed this the way she processed everything, clinically first. A large man, lean but solid in the way of someone who moved deliberately through the world, maybe early to mid-30s, East Asian features, and a face that even unconscious had this particular quality to it, an arrangement of jaw and brow and closed eyes that registered as controlled even in collapse. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and frozen there. His coat was expensive, or had been once, the kind of wool that didn't come from department stores. One of his gloves was missing. The bare hand was the color of old wax. She grabbed his wrist and found the radial pulse, or tried to. It was there, technically, 40 beats a minute, maybe less. His skin was cold enough that she pulled her hand back instinctively. "Hey!" She put her hand against his jaw, tipped his head. "Hey, open your eyes." Nothing. She checked his airway. Open. Breathing. Shallow, present, but like a machine running on the last quarter tank. His lips had that particular blue-gray that meant stage 2 hypothermia was already deep, and stage 3 was waiting around the corner with its hands in its pockets. Talia looked up and down Ashland Avenue. The storm swallowed both directions. One car had fishtailed into a snowbank half a block north, and its hazards blinked orange and useless in the white. She looked at her phone and thought about calling 911, and thought about the ambulance response time she already knew by heart on a clear night in this neighborhood, let alone this one, and thought about what stage 3 hypothermia looked like in a man this size. And then she stopped thinking and started doing what she always did. She grabbed him under both arms and started pulling. It was not graceful. He had to have 60 pounds on her, and every one of them was dead weight. And the ice on the sidewalk meant her feet kept sliding out from under her, and by the time she got him to the edge of the curb, she was already sweating under her coat, despite the cold, and her back was going to hate her for this tomorrow. She had to stop twice. Once to reposition her grip, once to breathe. He made a sound the second time, something low and indistinct, and she said, I know, stay with me," the same way she said it in the trauma bay. Like authority was a thing she could just loan someone when they needed it. Her apartment was a block and a half away. It took her 22 minutes. She would not remember most of those 22 minutes with any clarity afterward. She remembered the wind. She remembered the way the snow packed against the back of her neck where her collar couldn't reach. She remembered that a car slowed at one point and she thought it was going to stop and help her, and then it kept going, and she said something ugly to its taillights. She remembered that the man made 2 more sounds, one that might have been a word, one that was just breath. And both times she talked at him the way she talked at patients in the elevator, pointless words at a volume designed to keep them tethered. She remembered the way her hands shook getting her keys out. Inside, she dragged him to the couch and immediately went for the wet coat. This part she knew. Wet clothing was killing him faster than the cold itself by this point. She worked quickly, efficiently, no wasted motion. Coat off, sweater underneath, cut away with the EMT shears she kept in her work bag, because old habits, the undershirt already damp and freezing against his skin. She got blankets, 3 of them, the big fleece one and the 2 quilts from her bed, and wrapped him in layers, then made the conscious decision not to use direct heat on the extremities yet because rewarming shock was real, and she had seen it kill people who'd survived the cold. She put a knit cap on him. She put socks on his feet, which required a level of wrestling she had not anticipated. She made tea, not for hospitality, because warm liquids were the safest way to raise core temperature in someone who wasn't intubated and couldn't consent to an IV. She held the mug near his mouth and let the steam work, and then, when he stirred enough to show some swallowing reflex, carefully tipped small amounts past his lips and told him to swallow, and he did, which was a good sign, which meant the brain was still running the most basic protocols. His pulse was 54 beats a minute when she checked again at 11:40. She sat in the chair across from her couch, pulled her knees up, and looked at him. Now that the clinical emergency had narrowed to monitoring and time, her brain had a moment to do the thing it had been trying to do since she found him. Actually look at him. Not as a body in distress, as a person. He was, she thought in the blunt and purely observational way of someone too tired to be indirect with herself, exceptionally good-looking in a way that seemed almost inconveniently timed. Sharp jaw, long nose, the kind of bone structure that photographers chase. But it was the hands that she kept coming back to, the way even unconscious his left hand had closed into something close to a fist on top of the blanket, like even in collapse his body was holding on to some posture of readiness, and the knuckles. She had cleaned the cut on his forehead. She hadn't cleaned the knuckles yet. She hadn't looked that hard. Now she did, carefully pulling back the blanket to lift his right hand into the lamplight, and what she saw there made her sit very still for a moment. Those were not injuries from falling in the snow. Talia put his hand back down. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the front door. She thought, you don't actually know who you let into your apartment. She thought, he has a pulse of 54 and is wrapped in your grandmother's quilt and is not currently a threat to anything. She thought, you've been up for 16 hours and you lost Marcus Webb tonight, and you do not have the bandwidth for this particular existential crisis right now. She got up and made herself a second mug of tea, the strong kind, and sat back down in the chair and watched him breathe. He started coming back around 2 in the morning. It happened in stages. First, just the small involuntary movements, a slight shift of the shoulders, a slow turn of the head, the hand tightening on the blanket. Then a quality change in his breathing, deeper and more deliberate, like the body remembering how to do it correctly. Then his eyes opened. They were dark, very dark, with that particular quality of coming awake in an unfamiliar place where the first instinct isn't confusion, but assessment. He did not look frightened. He looked, for about 3 full seconds, like something that was calculating. Then he saw her. Talia was sitting across from him in the chair she had not left, mug in both hands, watching him with the level and calm expression she used on patients waking from sedation. Present, reassuring, not performing anything. You're in my apartment, she said. You were in hypothermic arrest outside the pharmacy on Ashland. I'm a trauma nurse. Your core temp was dangerously low when I got you here. You've been warming up for about 2 hours. He said nothing. He was still doing the calculation thing with his eyes. You have a cut above your left eyebrow, she continued. Cleaned and butterflied. Nothing that needs stitching. You have some frostbite risk on your right hand, Russ. Your glove was missing. I've been monitoring your pulse. It's back to normal range. She paused. Can you tell me your name? A long silence. Outside, the wind hit the windows. Kyle, he said. His voice was rough with cold and disuse, lower than she had expected. Last name? His jaw shifted. Han. Okay, Kyle Han. Do you know what day it is? He told her the date without hesitation. Do you know where you are in Chicago? South Side. He shifted against the cushion, slow and careful, and she watched him process the fact that his coat was gone, that he was in blankets, that there was a stranger watching him with calm eyes in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and something herbal, and that he appeared to be, and this seemed to genuinely confuse him, safe. How far from Ashland and 47th? About a block and a half north. She tilted her head. How much do you remember? Snow. A pause. Walking. His eyes moved to the window where the storm was still hammering the glass. Cold. Do you remember how you ended up outside that pharmacy? Something shifted in his expression. Not evasion exactly, more like a door closing quietly. I remember cold. Talia decided not to push it. She got up, went to the kitchen, poured hot water from the kettle into a clean mug, and brought it back to him. He looked at it, then at her. It's just tea, she said. Drink it slowly. He took the mug with both hands and she watched the way he did it, carefully, like someone who hadn't been handed things without conditions in a long time. He didn't drink immediately. He held it in a way that suggested the warmth itself was the point. You should probably have someone take you to Mercy Heights for a proper evaluation, she said, settling back into her chair. Hypothermia can do things that don't show up for a few hours. No hospital. She had expected that. Okay. Then you're not going out in that storm tonight. The temperature's dropped another 6 degrees since I brought you in. You'd be back where I found you inside of 20 minutes. He looked at her steadily. You don't know me. No. This is your home. Yes. You dragged an unconscious stranger off the street and brought him into your home. The way he said it was not grateful and not ungrateful. It was genuinely puzzled, like she had performed an action that fell outside the parameters of what people did. Talia shrugged one shoulder. You were dying. I'm a nurse. What was I supposed to do? Walk past, he said. Like everyone else did. There was no self-pity in it. It was a statement of fact delivered flatly, and that flatness bothered her more than if he'd sounded wounded. She looked at him across the lamplight and thought, how long have you been someone that people walk past? She didn't say it. Do you want more tea, or do you want to try to sleep? I have a clean t-shirt that will probably fit you, and I can make up the couch properly. You're not afraid of me. It came out like an interruption, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like something he'd been sitting with since he opened his eyes. Talia considered the honest answer. I've worked trauma for 14 years. I've had patients who were gang members, domestic abusers, convicted felons, people with every kind of violence in their history, and my job is never to be afraid of them in the moment they need help. Fear doesn't make good care. She paused. Besides, you're wrapped in my grandmother's quilt. It's hard to be intimidating in my grandmother's quilt. His expression did not change, but something behind it did, very slightly, like pressure releasing a millimeter at a time. She made it? Talia looked down at the pattern of blues and grays across his chest. Yeah, she did. A beat. She died 4 years ago. She was the one who got me through nursing school. She hadn't meant to say that. She blamed the hour and the exhaustion and the particular way that grief sometimes surfaced in the strangest gaps. Kyle said nothing. He looked at the quilt. I'm sorry, he said finally. 2 words, and they came out like they cost him something. Thank you. She stood up. I'm going to get you that shirt, and then I'm going to sleep for a few hours because I've been awake since 5 a.m., and if I don't, I'll be useless. You stay here, stay warm, and if anything feels wrong, chest pain, numbness that isn't going away, confusion, you wake me up. She was almost to the hallway when he spoke again. What's your name? She looked back over her shoulder. Talia. Talia Mercer. He held her gaze for a moment with those calculating dark eyes that had stopped calculating and become something else she didn't have a word for yet. "Thank you, Talia Mercer," he said. She nodded once and went to find the shirt. She slept fitfully. Not because of fear. The fear question kept coming back to her, and the honest answer was that she genuinely wasn't, which was possibly insane, and possibly just the emotional flatness of a 14-hour shift followed by watching Marcus Webb die, or possibly something about Kyle Hahn himself that she couldn't put into clinical language yet. She dreamed in fragments. The ER. The yellow door and a child's crayon drawing. Snow. She woke at 6:15 to the sound of her coffee maker. Talia sat up in bed for a moment, placed that sound in the context of the night before, and then got up and went to the kitchen doorway and stopped. Kyle was standing at her kitchen counter. He had found the coffee, which was not where she usually kept it, which meant he had gone through at least one wrong cabinet first, and was making it with the focused precision of someone who needed to be doing something with their hands. He was wearing the gray t-shirt she'd left him that fit well enough, and the blanket was draped over his shoulders like a cape he seemed unconscious of, and the morning light through the kitchen window was thin and pale, and he stood in it like a man who wasn't sure he was allowed to. She had a moment, before he heard her, of seeing him without the layering of crisis and assessment. Just a person in her kitchen in the early morning making coffee, with his bare feet on her tile floor and her grandmother's quilt around his shoulders, and she thought, there's something wrong with how alone this person is. Not wrong like a moral failing. Wrong like an injury that had been there so long, it had started to look like just the shape of him. Then he heard her and turned, and the look was gone, replaced by something more composed. "There's coffee," he said. "I see that." She went to the cabinet and got 2 mugs. He poured without being asked. She noticed he'd remembered which mug she'd been using the night before. They stood in the kitchen drinking coffee, and for a long time neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable in the way silences usually were. It was the kind of quiet that exists between people who have already crossed some threshold together, even if neither of them had named it yet. "The storm broke," he said, "around 4. She looked out the window. The sky was the particular shade of white-gray that came after heavy snow. The streets below were buried, but still. "You should still wait a few more hours. Your core temp needs—" "I know." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I'm not going anywhere yet." Something in the certainty of it, not demanding, just factual, settled in her chest in a way she didn't examine too closely. "Are you hungry?" "Yes." She made eggs. He sat at the small kitchen table, the same table that usually held her nursing journals and her third-shift meal prep containers and the crossword puzzle she'd been doing in pieces for 2 weeks, and watched her cook with the same quality of attention he'd given everything since he woke up. Like watching was something he'd had to learn to do up close. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it. "When's the last time someone cooked for you?" she asked, not unkindly. A pause. "I don't remember." "Okay." She sat down with her own plate. "Then eat slowly." He did. She watched him take the first bite with the particular care of someone relearning a thing, and then something gave slightly in the set of his shoulders, and he ate. They talked over breakfast in the fragmented, exploratory way of strangers who have been through something together. Not personals, not yet, but the kind of talking that tests the edges, figures out where the walls are. She asked what he did vaguely. He said business, even more vaguely. She didn't push. He asked about nursing, and she found herself talking, about Mercy Heights, about the ER, about the specific exhaustion of emergency medicine that was different from any other exhaustion she knew, about the way some shifts left you hollow, and some filled you back up, and you never knew which kind it was going to be until you were already deep in it. He listened the way few people listened, not waiting for his turn, actually listening, eyes on her face, absorbing. It was, she thought, both pleasant and slightly unnerving, like standing in direct sunlight after a long time in shade. "You lost someone last night," he said at one point. Not a question. She looked up from her coffee. "How did you—" "The way you talked about it." He didn't explain further. Talia set her mug down. 53 years old, 4 kids, he had pictures of them in his pocket. She stopped. He should have made it. The numbers were on his side. Kale said nothing for a moment, then, "Did you do everything right?" "Yes." "Then the outcome isn't yours." She looked at him. The words were simple, and he'd said them without decoration, without the performance of comfort, and somehow that made them hit differently than all the careful condolences people had offered her over years of loss in that hospital. She felt her throat tighten briefly, and then release. "That's easier to say than to believe," she said. "I know," he replied. And again, there was no elaboration, no softening, just the acknowledgement of a fact. And somehow, that was enough. He left at 9:15, when the plows had made Ashland passable. 3 black SUVs appeared at her corner without her seeing them arrive, which she would think about later. The fact that they had been waiting, and for how long, and what that said about who he was and what his world looked like. He put on his coat and stood at her door and looked at her with those quiet dark eyes and said, "You saved my life." "Technically, your body saved your life," she said. "I just helped it remember how." Something close to a smile moved through his expression. Not a full one, more like the shadow of one, as if the actual version was being held in reserve. "Thank you, Talia." "Take care of that hand," she said, "and get your core temp checked properly in the next 24 hours. I mean it." "I will." He left. She closed the door and stood in her apartment, which felt different now. Not wrong, but differently sized. Like a room where furniture has been rearranged, and you keep reaching for things in the wrong places. She looked at the couch, where his outline was still pressed into the cushions. She looked at the kitchen table with the 2 plates. She picked up both mugs and stood at the sink and washed them slowly, thinking about nothing in particular or trying to. She did not expect to hear from him again. She was wrong about that. The first sign came 4 days later. She came home after a double shift and found a coat hanging on her door handle. Not hanging, it was folded over the handle with a precision that felt deliberate, wrapped in brown paper with no card, no note, no explanation. It was a long wool coat, the kind that went down below the knee, in a deep charcoal gray. She held it for a long time in the hallway. Then she put it on. It fit like it had been made for her. She didn't think about what that meant. The second sign came the following week when she found 2 bags of groceries on her doorstep at 11 p.m. after a closing shift, including every item from the list she kept on her kitchen counter that she kept meaning to get to and never had time for. She stood in the hallway looking at the bags and then looked up and down the empty corridor and felt something in her chest that she was not ready to name. The third sign came from outside. She'd been ignoring the burned-out streetlight in the alley beside her building for 3 months. The same 3 months she'd been filing maintenance requests that went nowhere. One morning, it was repaired. Not by the city. The city didn't work like that on Talia's block. Someone had sent someone. She called the number he'd left in her phone. She didn't remember him putting it there, but it was there. The name simply KH. And when he answered on the second ring, she said, "I know it's you." A pause. "Know what is me?" "The coat. The groceries. The streetlight." Another pause. Longer. She could hear the distance in it, and beneath the distance, something else that sounded like someone deciding how honest to be. "You work late shifts," he said finally. "You walk home alone. The light was a hazard." "Kael." "Yes." "Why?" The silence that followed was different from the others. "Because you did something no one has done for me in a long time," he said. "Possibly ever. I don't have another language for this." She stood in her kitchen with her hand on the counter and thought about a man who sent groceries and fixed streetlights because he didn't have the language for thank you, and thought about the way he'd held her grandmother's quilt around his shoulders in the pale morning light without knowing he was doing it. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yeah, okay." She paused. "But next time ask me what I actually need, because what I actually need is a functioning heating system in my unit, and I have a feeling you probably have people for that." This time the silence had a different quality again. She couldn't see his face, but she would learn later to read his silences the way other people read expressions, and this one felt warm. "I'll look into it," he said. "I figured you would." She sat down at her kitchen table. "How's your hand?" "Better." "Liar." "How's your hand, actually?" "A beat." "Still stiff. Cold weather doesn't help." "Use heat for 20 minutes twice a day. Not direct. Rapid. And take ibuprofen if it's inflamed, not aspirin." She paused. "Did you get your core temp checked?" "Yes." "And?" "Normal range." "Good." She pulled her knees up to her chest in the chair. Outside, February had gone gray and heavy. "Are you okay? Generally, broadly." The silence this time lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. People don't usually ask me that, he said. I know. How's your hand and are you okay? Two very different questions. You answered the first one. Take your time with the second. He didn't answer that night, but he didn't hang up either. They stayed on the phone for another 40 minutes, talking about nothing important. Chicago winter logistics, her shift schedule, a book she was reading, a neighborhood she'd grown up in. And she noticed that he was very good at being present in a conversation without volunteering much of himself, like someone who had learned to navigate social space the way some people navigated dangerous terrain, careful, measured, conserving energy, always knowing where the exits were. She noticed that when she made him laugh, only twice, both times at something dry and unexpected, he made a sound like he'd been surprised into it, like laughter was something that happened to him rather than something he did. She noticed that she was not in any hurry to hang up. By the time March arrived, the phone calls were a nightly ritual. She would get home from whatever shift she'd pulled, shed her scrubs, make tea or something stronger depending on what the night had brought, and he would call. Or she would call him. She stopped tracking who initiated it. It didn't matter. He began telling her things in the dark. Not personal history, not yet, but pieces, impressions. The way he described the city was something she had never heard before. Chicago from a vantage point that was both above it and beneath it simultaneously, its power structures and its pressure points and its loyalties and its betrayals, all laid out in precise language that told her things about the world he moved through without saying a word about it directly. She told him about the community center on 63rd Street, where she spent her Thursday evenings mentoring teenagers who were navigating the specific minefield of being 16 in neighborhoods that didn't forgive mistakes. About Deja, 17, who wanted to be an architect and was the most mathematically gifted student Talia had ever encountered and was failing 2 classes because her home situation made studying impossible. About Marcus, not the Marcus she'd lost, a different one, 15, who made everyone around him laugh, but who Talia watched with the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to read the specific weight that certain teenagers carried. Kale listened. 2 days after she told him about Deja, she got a message from the community center director that an anonymous scholarship application had been submitted in Deja's name for a STEM summer program she hadn't even known existed. Full funding, housing included, transportation covered. Talia called him immediately. Did you do that? The program has excellent outcomes. 63% of participants go on to 4-year engineering programs. That's not what I asked. I looked into it. She was standing in the center's parking lot in the dark with the wind coming off the lake, and she was somewhere between furious and something that had no clean name. Kale, you can't just... She's a kid who doesn't know you, and I told you about her in confidence, and the application was submitted anonymously, he said. She'll never know who funded it. Her name came to the attention of the program through normal channels. A pause. What she does with it is entirely her own. Talia stood very still in the cold. You could have asked me first. Yes, he said. I should have. I'm sorry. The apology landed simply and without defense, and that stopped her momentum more than any argument would have. She stood there in the parking lot for another moment. She's going to get in, she said finally. Yes, he said. She is. And she's going to become something extraordinary. That was already going to happen, he said. This just clears some of the obstacles. Talia pressed her hand against her forehead. You're impossible, she said. It came out softer than she'd intended. Probably, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you, Kale. But next time you ask me first. Next time I will ask you first, he said, and she believed him. It was 2 weeks after that, a Thursday night in the middle of March, when she finally asked him the question she'd been holding since the night she found him in the snow. They'd been on the phone for almost an hour, the conversation running through exhaustion into the stranger territory that late night facilitated. And there was a particular quiet that had settled, and she said, The night I found you, what happened? The silence was long. I had been outside for some time, he said carefully. I figured that out. She waited. There was a situation, he said, that escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was separated from my associates. Kael. Yes. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. All right. Are you someone I should be afraid of? The silence this time was different. Not evasion. She was learning to feel the difference. but something genuinely considered. In your world, he said finally, probably yes. In mine, I have never heard anyone who wasn't in the business of doing harm to others. That's a very carefully constructed sentence. It's the most honest one I can give you right now. Talia looked at the ceiling of her apartment, the familiar water stain in the corner that she'd been ignoring since she moved in. She thought about the knuckles, the SUVs, the precision with which things got done when Kyle Hahn decided they needed doing. She thought about a lot of things very quickly and very honestly. Okay, she said. Okay, that answer's enough. For now. A beat. I'm not naive, Kale. I grew up 4 blocks from here. I know what certain kinds of power look like. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. He said nothing. But I need you to never lie to me, she said. Whatever else this is or becomes, don't lie. The silence held for a moment. I don't lie to you, he said quietly. I haven't. I won't. She believed him. She wasn't sure what that said about her judgment, but she believed him. Outside her window, Chicago moved in the dark. Sirens in the middle distance. The elevated train on the Green Line 2 blocks east. The particular percussion of a city that never fully slept, even in the cold. She lay on her back looking at the ceiling and listened to him breathe across the phone and thought about how strange it was that the person who made her feel most present in her own life was someone whose last name she'd only known for 3 weeks. Kyle, she said. Yes. How long were you out there before I found you? Actually. A very long pause. Long enough, he said, that I was beginning to believe no one would. She closed her eyes. There it was. The thing she'd felt in the shape of him from the first morning in her kitchen, the injury that had been there so long it had become just the structure of who he was. She felt it land in her chest, that particular ache that wasn't sympathy and wasn't pity but was something closer to recognition. The knowledge of what it felt like to carry too much alone for too many years and to have become so good at it that you'd stop noticing you were doing it. She thought about her grandmother, gone 4 years. Her mother, gone 7. The particular shape of a life in which you learn to be your own constant, because everyone you relied on has left one way or another. You're not out there anymore, she said. He was quiet for a long time. No, he said finally. I'm not. She fell asleep before they ended the call, and she didn't know until later that he had stayed on the line for another 37 minutes, just listening to her breathe in the dark before quietly ending it. She found out a week later when she asked him about it. He told her the truth. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, Good. And he didn't ask what she meant by that because he already knew. By the last week of March, what they had stopped being explainable in the terms she'd started with and became something else entirely. Not labeled, not announced, but real the way things are real when they stop requiring definition. And that was when she began to understand, slowly, and then all at once, that Kyle Hahn was not simply a man she had pulled from the cold. He was a man who had been built for a world without mercy, and she was the first person in that world who had showed him some. She just had no idea, yet, what that meant for both of them, or what was already moving in the dark at the edge of his world, watching, noticing her, marking her as the one thing in Kyle Hahn's universe that he had never had before, a vulnerability. April arrived in Chicago the way it always did, not as relief, but as negotiation. The snow retreated grudgingly, leaving behind the gray-brown residue of a winter that had overstayed itself. Sand-grit sidewalks, waterlogged planters, the particular smell of the city uncovering itself like something that had been stored wrong. The lake was still steel cold. The wind hadn't forgiven anyone. But the light was different, coming in at a different angle through Talia's kitchen window in the mornings. And she noticed it the way she noticed things she hadn't been told to look for, peripherally, with a small quiet feeling she didn't name. Kale called every night. She stopped being surprised by it around the second week. What she didn't stop being surprised by was him. The way the calls had developed their own architecture, her talking first because she was usually the one still running on shift adrenaline and needing to decompress, and him listening with that quality of attention that she had decided by now was not a performance, was just actually who he was. And then gradually, as the hour got later and the city got quieter around both of them, the balance shifting. Him talking. Not much, not personal. But more than nothing, which was more than she suspected he gave most people. She learned things in pieces. He had come to Chicago from Seoul at 17. He did not explain the circumstances of that. He had built something here from a position she understood was effectively zero. No resources, no language, no connections. And what he had built was, by any measure, substantial. He did not describe it in those terms. He described it as a system, something that required maintenance, something that had costs. She learned that he slept badly. She knew this because he was always awake when she called him at 11:30, 12, 1 in the morning, and the few times she'd asked, he'd said simply that sleep had never been cooperative. She learned that he ate the same 3 things when left to his own devices, and that the eggs she'd made him that first morning had been, in his words, an anomaly. She learned that he had people around him constantly and was nevertheless the most functionally alone person she had ever encountered, and that these 2 facts coexisted in him without apparent contradiction because he had built the system that way, deliberately, a long time ago. She learned that when she laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from somewhere honest, he went quiet in a way that she had initially read as discomfort, and had later understood was something closer to the opposite. She did not learn who had hurt him the night she found him in the snow. She stopped asking. What she didn't know was that the man who'd put Kyle in the snow that night had not been forgotten, had not been forgiven, had in fact been located, assessed, and handled in the particular way that Kyle Han handled things that required handling, which left no trace and generated no noise and resulted in an outcome that would not be discovered for several weeks. She didn't know this. She wouldn't know this for a long time. And by the time she did, other things would have already happened that made it feel like a small problem in a larger constellation. The first crack appeared on a Thursday. She was at the community center on 63rd, in the back room that served as a homework help space on weekday evenings, when Marcus, 15, the funny one, the one she watched, didn't show up for the 3rd week in a row. She asked one of the other kids about it with the kind of casual precision that was actually its opposite, and the answer she got was vague in the specific way that meant the kid knew something and had decided not to be the one to say it. She called Kyle from the parking lot. "Something's wrong with Marcus," she said without preamble. "Tell me." Not what's wrong or what happened. Just tell me, immediate, like he'd been waiting for the call to matter. She told him what she had, which wasn't much. 3 absences. A vague answer from a peer. The particular quality of a teenager who had been navigating something bad and getting good at not showing it. "I've been watching him for 2 months," she said. "He's got the laugh that boys use when they're scared. I know that laugh." A silence on his end, not a thinking silence, a knowing one. "What's his address?" "Kyle, I'm not going to touch him. I want to know his block." She hesitated, then she gave it. "Okay," he said. "What does okay mean?" "It means I know that block." Another pause. "There's a crew that's been recruiting on that stretch for about 6 weeks. Younger than they usually go." Talia felt the cold come up through her shoes from the asphalt. "How young?" 14, 15. "Has he—" "I don't know yet." A beat. "I'll find out." "You'll find out," she repeated. "And then what?" "And then we'll know what we're dealing with." She stood in the parking lot with the wind coming off the lake and thought about a 15-year-old with a good laugh and no margin for error and the particular math of a neighborhood that didn't offer a lot of off-ramps once you were on a certain road. "I need you to tell me what you find," she said. "Not manage it. Tell me." "I'll tell you," he said. She believed him and also knew that telling and managing were not mutually exclusive in his world, and that he believed he was making a commitment while also believing that the commitment and the management could coexist. She filed that discrepancy away. He called back 48 hours later. "He hasn't been recruited yet," Kale said. "He's been watched. There's a difference." "How much of a difference?" "Significant. They haven't approached him directly. They're in the ambient pressure phase, presence, visibility, normalization. It usually precedes a formal approach by 2 to 3 weeks. Talia was sitting at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she hadn't touched. "How do you know the timeline?" A pause. "Because I know how these things are structured. Because you've been on one side of this structure." Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." She pushed the soup bowl 2 inches to the left. "What do we do?" The we landed in the space between them and she felt him take it in and hold it. You keep him engaged at the center, Kael said. Occupied, purposeful, connected to adults he trusts. That's the strongest counter to that kind of ambient pressure. It doesn't argue against it. It just makes the alternative feel more real. And on your end? On my end, the crew on his block is going to find that their operations in that corridor become significantly more complicated in the next 2 weeks. Talia was quiet. I'm not going to pretend that's a clean solution, he said, before she could speak. It's not. It moves the problem. It doesn't fix the underlying conditions. No, she said. It doesn't. But it buys him time. And time for a 15-year-old is sometimes the only thing that matters. She sat with that for a moment, the pragmatism of it, the way it sat uncomfortably alongside everything she believed about systems change and root causes and the community center work she'd been doing for 6 years. That was ultimately also just buying individual kids, individual time, in a structure that would keep producing the same pressures until something much larger changed. Okay, she said, you're not happy about it. I'm not happy about any of it. I'm working with what's real. Another quiet, then, that's what I do every day. She looked at the soup. I know, she said. I know it is. The call ended without resolution, which she was getting used to. Their conversations didn't wrap up. They stopped, at points of mutual exhaustion or honesty, like pressing pause on something that was always in motion. She went back to the center on Tuesday, and Marcus was there. He was quieter than usual. The laugh was still there, but it was running a little lower, a little more controlled, the way sound gets when someone is managing it consciously. She sat with him over his math homework for an hour and didn't bring it up and just did the work. And at some point his shoulders came down from around his ears and he started talking about wanting to study mechanical engineering, which she had not known. And she stayed with that for a long time and asked him real questions about it and watched his face change. She texted Kael from the parking lot afterward. He's still here, he's okay. The reply came in under 30 seconds. Good. Then, 2 minutes later, does he actually want to study engineering, or was that for your benefit? She smiled despite herself. He described the internal combustion engine for 12 minutes. It was not for my benefit. A longer pause. Then, I'll make a call. Kael, a legitimate call. There's a Saturday program at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Mechanical focus. Free. Talia stared at her phone, then, you have to stop doing that. The scholarship for Deja is producing measurable outcomes. This is the same principle. The principle isn't the problem. Doing it without asking is the problem. We talked about this. I'm telling you before I do it. That's asking. She laughed out loud in the empty parking lot. The laugh surprised her. That is not what asking means, and you know it. I'm learning, he wrote back, and she could hear the almost smile in it, and that was somehow the most disarming thing he'd ever said to her. She typed back. Saturday program. IIT. Yes, but you talk to me first next time, not after. Understood. She drove home with the windows down despite the cold, which she never did, and thought about a man learning to ask for things in a world that had never taught him he was allowed to. The second crack appeared 10 days later, and it was not small. She was coming out of Mercy Heights at 7:15 in the morning after a night shift that had been the particular kind of brutal where nothing was spectacular and everything was just relentlessly bad. 3 simultaneous traumas, 2 of which resolved and 1 of which didn't, a 4-hour stretch where the ER was backed up past any functional capacity, and an attending who'd been on for 20 hours and whose judgment had started to reflect that in ways she had to work around quietly and without causing a scene. She was wearing the charcoal coat he'd left on her door handle, which she wore most cold days now without thinking about it, and she was thinking about nothing except the logistics of getting from the hospital entrance to her car without falling down. A man was leaning against the wall near the parking structure entrance. She registered him the way she registered everything on the tail end of a night shift, peripherally, functionally, threat assessment first because South Side at 7 a.m. in a hospital parking structure was not a place to walk with your head down. Average height, late 40s, nice coat, too still for someone waiting on a person, and too positioned for someone waiting on a car. He was watching her. She kept her pace even and reached for her keys and was 3 car lengths from her own vehicle when he pushed off the wall and took 2 steps toward her and said, Ms. Mercer. She stopped, turned. I'm not here to cause you any trouble, he said. He had a flat Chicago accent, a flat Chicago affect, the specific blank pleasantness of someone in the business of delivering messages. I just want to have a brief conversation. I don't know you, she said. No, but you know someone I know. He tilted his head slightly. Or someone who knows you, I should say. Her keys were in her right hand. She stayed where she was. Say what you want to say. He took a moment like he was arranging something. Then, Kyle Han has acquired certain attachments lately. That's a new thing for him. People in his circle have noticed. People outside his circle have noticed. He paused. You are a person who has nothing to do with any of this. You have a good job in a community center and a life that has no business being inside whatever story he's writing. Talia looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something it didn't usually do. Not racing exactly, but present in a way she was aware of. Are you threatening me? Absolutely not. He seemed genuinely clear on this. I'm trying to help you. There's a difference. Who sent you? I work for a man named Dario Vasquez. He and Kyle Han have a professional arrangement, a long-standing one. Vasquez wants Han focused. Vasquez is concerned about distractions. So Vasquez sent his man to threaten the distraction in a hospital parking structure at 7 in the morning, a slight adjustment of expression. I told you, it's not. I work 14-hour shifts and then I go to a community center and I mentor teenagers and I go home and I sleep and I do it again, she said. Her voice was even. She had learned how to keep her voice even from years of delivering bad news. I have never been inside anything. I don't know the specifics of what Kyle Han does, and I haven't asked, and that's a choice I've made with open eyes. But I'm going to need you to hear me when I tell you that whoever sent you here made a mistake. He looked at her for a moment. I'm going to need you to leave now, she said. He studied her for another beat. Then he nodded once, a small professional acknowledgement, and walked past her toward the structure exit without another word. Talia stood in the parking structure after he was gone and listened to herself breathe for a minute. Slow, even, in and out. She was not shaking. She noticed that with something between professional detachment and mild surprise. She got in her car and sat there, and then she called Kyle. He picked up on the first ring. Talia. A man named... He said he worked for someone named Dario Vasquez. He was outside my hospital this morning. The silence on his end was immediate and total, and in its quality was something that made the back of her neck go cold. Not because he sounded frightened, because he sounded exactly the opposite of frightened. The coldness that moved into his voice in the next 2 seconds was not fear. It was something that was completely controlled and completely merciless, and she understood in that moment, for the first time with her whole body rather than just her intellect, exactly who she was talking to. Are you in your car? He said. Yes. Lock it. Don't go home yet. I'm going to send... Kyle. Her voice cut through his. I'm fine. He didn't touch me. He didn't threaten me. He gave me a speech about distractions and left when I told him to. I am telling you because you need to know, not because I need rescuing. A silence. Talia. I'm fine, she said again, and the repetition was not for his benefit, she realized, but for hers. A thing said twice to make it true. I drove myself here. I'll drive myself home. But we need to talk, tonight. Yes, he said. We do. He was at her apartment by 9 p.m., which surprised her. She'd expected him to arrive with the standard convoy arrangement, and he arrived alone. Just him in a black car he drove himself, which she had never seen him do before. She answered the door, and he came inside and looked at her the way she imagined you looked at someone after you'd spent the last 2 hours in a private hell she wasn't privy to. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same positions they'd been in the first morning, and looked at him straight on. Tell me about Vasquez. Kyle put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Dario Vasquez runs the Northwest Corridor, distribution primarily. We have agreements that have been in place for 4 years. A pause. He's been looking for leverage over me for 2 years. He hasn't had any. Until now. He looked up. Until now. Yes. The honesty of it landed like something heavy. She had asked for honesty, and he had delivered it, and she found that the truth didn't make things simpler, just more precisely complicated. He sees me as leverage. Yes. What does that mean practically? It means Vasquez is moving toward a confrontation that he believes he now has a tool for. KL's jaw was tight. Sending that man this morning was a test, to see if I would overreact, And how? To see how visible you are to me. And how are you going to respond? The response I want to give and the response I should give are not the same thing, he said. Very flat, very controlled. Tell me the response you want to give. He looked at her. You know the answer to that. Say it. A beat. I want to remove the problem entirely. And the response you should give? His hands on the table shifted slightly. I should contact Vasquez directly and make clear that any approach toward you constitutes a termination of all existing agreements and the beginning of a conflict he can't sustain. Structured deterrence. The rational play. But you don't want to make the rational play. No, he said, I don't. She looked at him, the muscle in his jaw, the particular quality of stillness that was not peace, but the effort of containing something that didn't want to be contained. She thought about the man in the parking structure, his flat professional affect, the specific calibration of his message. She thought about Dario Vasquez, whom she'd never met, deciding she was a tool in something she hadn't consented to be a part of. She thought about her grandmother's quilt, and the man who hadn't known he was holding it like something precious. Kyle, she said. Yes. I'm not a problem you need to solve. He was quiet. I'm also not a liability you need to protect. I'm a person you made a choice about. She paused, and I made a choice about you, and I'd like us to have the actual conversation about what that means instead of you going off and handling this and coming back to tell me it's resolved. His hands came together on the table. What conversation do you want to have? The one where you tell me what I'm actually in the middle of, not the managed version, not the version that's meant to not alarm me, the real one. A long silence. Outside, the city went about its business. A siren rose and fell 3 blocks east. What I do, he said carefully, involves significant control over the movement of resources through this city. Illegal resources. The infrastructure that moves them, the relationships that protect them, the systems that govern how competing interests stay aligned. He paused. I have maintained a position in this city for 11 years through a combination of force, intelligence, and the understanding that stability is worth more to everyone than war. And Vasquez. Vasquez is a man who has been stable for 4 years because aligning with me was more profitable than fighting me. Something has changed in that calculation for him. I don't yet know what. But it's connected to me. Yes, that's my fault. No. The word came out with a sharpness that surprised both of them. He stopped. Then, more levelly. That is not your fault. You didn't choose this. I did. He stopped again. Looked at his hands. I stopped being careful. The admission sat in the kitchen like something physical. When you say careful, she said slowly, I mean that I have spent 11 years ensuring that nothing about my personal life was visible enough to be used. That meant keeping everything at a distance, everyone at a distance. He was talking to the table rather than to her, which told her how much it was costing him. I was not careful with you. I didn't want to be. Talia sat very still. I'm not saying this to ask you for anything, he said quickly, and the speed of it revealed him more than the words. I'm saying it because you asked for the truth. I know why you're saying it. She exhaled slowly. Kael, look at me. He looked up. She held his gaze for a long moment. I know what I walked into. I'm not pretending I didn't see the SUVs or the knuckles or the way things just got taken care of when you decided they needed to be. I made a choice with open eyes, and I'm still making it. She paused. But I need you to trust me enough to tell me what's actually happening, not after you've handled it. During. Do you understand? Yes. And I need you to make the rational play with Vasquez. His jaw tightened. I know what you want to do. I know why you want to do it. And I'm telling you that what I need from you right now is not a man who burns things down on my behalf. I need the man who is strategic enough to have held this city for 11 years. She leaned forward slightly. Use that man, okay? He looked at her for a long time. Something moved through his expression. Not surrender, not agreement exactly, but something closer to the specific effort of a person who has operated on instinct for so long that choosing deliberately feels like learning a new language in real time. Okay, he said. Good. She got up. Do you want coffee or do you want something stronger? Coffee, he said. A beat. Please. She went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker and stood at the counter with her back to him and thought, this is the moment, right here. This is the one where the thing tips from whatever it was into whatever it's going to be. And there's no clean way back from it. And you are going in with your eyes open and your hands steady, and whatever happens next, you chose it. She heard him shift in the chair behind her, the quiet movement of a man trying to sit in a space without filling it wrong. She thought about the quilt. She thought about Marcus Webb's kids and the yellow door and the dog they were going to get when he came home. She thought about Deja, who was going to get into a STEM program and become something extraordinary because a man who moved illegal resources through Chicago had decided she deserved a clear path. She thought about the crack that had appeared in Kyle Hahn's perfectly constructed world the night she dragged him through the snow, and the way that crack had been slowly, steadily getting larger every week in the amber light of her kitchen and the dark hours of late-night calls, and the fact that Dario Vasquez sending a man to a hospital parking structure at 7 in the morning was not a warning that things were dangerous. It was a confirmation that they had already become something else. The coffee maker finished. She poured 2 mugs and turned around and took them to the table and set one in front of him and sat down and looked at him across the steam. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then his phone buzzed on the table, once, and he glanced at it, and whatever he saw there made the careful composure he'd been maintaining with visible effort go still in a different way. Not controlled still, but the kind of still that happens right before something moves very fast. He looked up at her. "What is it?" she said. "One of my men," he said. "Near here." A pause, and in the pause was something she felt rather than heard. The intake of a situation expanding past the edges of what either of them had been managing. Vasquez didn't send a message this morning. She watched him. "He sent a scout," Kael said. The coffee in her mug had stopped steaming. Outside, somewhere on the block, a car engine started that had not been there a moment ago, and Kael was already on his feet, his hand on her arm, his body between her and the window before she had fully processed what was happening, and the night outside her apartment window changed. The car engine outside was wrong in 3 specific ways. Talia processed this in the half-second before Kael moved. Wrong time, wrong position, wrong idle, too low, too deliberate. The particular sound of an engine being held rather than warming. She had grown up on these streets. She knew the difference between a neighbor leaving for a night shift and something being placed. Kael's hand closed around her upper arm. Not rough, not asking. And he moved her away from the window with the efficiency of someone who had run this calculation before, many times, in rooms she would never see. His phone was already at his ear. He said 2 words in Korean she didn't understand and then switched to English so flat it didn't sound like language at all. "How many?" A pause. His eyes moved to the window without his body moving toward it, then to the door. "Side entrance. Go." He ended the call and looked at her. The man who had been sitting across her kitchen table drinking coffee and making visible effort not to be frightening was gone. What replaced him was not frightening exactly. It was beyond the vocabulary of frightening. The way certain things are beyond temperature, too cold to register as cold anymore. "There's a stairwell at the end of your hall," he said. "Goes to the service entrance on the alley side. I need you to move now, and I need you to stay close. How many people are outside?" "Enough." "Kael." "Talia." His eyes held hers for 1 second, and in that second was everything the controlled surface of him usually buried. The specific terror of a man who has never had anything that mattered, and now does and is watching it stand 3 feet from the thing that wants to take it. "Please." She moved. The hallway was empty and bright and felt immediately wrong, the fluorescent hum of it too loud, the carpet too patterned, the ordinary architecture of her building recontextualized into something that had never been safe. She didn't think about that. She counted doors the way she counted equipment in a trauma bay. Inventory, position, exit options. He was behind her and slightly to the right, one hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just present, and she felt him stop once to look back, and whatever he saw or didn't see made him move faster. At the stairwell door he pushed through first, checked it, and then they went down. 2 flights. Service level. The alley door had a push bar, and it gave easily, and then the cold hit them. April cold, damp, and sharp, the alley behind her building smelling of the dumpsters and the wet asphalt and old brick. 30 feet to her left, headlights. Not moving. Watching. "Don't look at them," he said quietly. "Walk right." They walked right. Behind them, from the direction of the building's front entrance, she heard something that might have been a raised voice and might have been nothing. She did not look back. She was good at not looking back. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life not looking at things that would make her stop moving. Kael's car was on the cross street, half a block north. They reached it, and he had the door open, and she was inside before she had finished deciding to get in. And then he was around and behind the wheel and moving before either door had fully closed. He drove without speaking. Not fast. That was the thing that lodged in her chest, the controlled pace of it, the way he moved through the south side streets at a speed that didn't draw attention, taking turns she hadn't anticipated, doubling once through a parking structure, emerging on a street she recognized only by the elevated tracks overhead. She watched him drive and said nothing. After 12 minutes, he pulled into the underground parking structure of a building in the South Loop that she had passed 100 times and never had reason to enter. He pulled into a space, killed the engine, and sat. His hands were on the wheel. He was breathing. Talia looked at the side of his face in the dark. "Tell me what just happened." Vasquez moved faster than I expected. He was still looking forward. "That was a positioning operation. They were establishing surveillance on your building. Possibly more." "Possibly more," she repeated. "What does more mean?" "It means I don't know yet." He turned and looked at her, and the particular quality of that look, raw in a way the rest of him almost never was, sat inside her chest and pressed. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you—" "I'm fine, Kael." She said it firmly, not to close him down, but to stop him from using her well-being as a place to put everything he couldn't say about the rest of it. "I need information. Give it to me." He did. Not everything. She would understand later that even then he was curating, not out of deception, but out of the deeply ingrained habit of a man who had learned that full information in the wrong hands was its own kind of weapon. But enough. Vasquez had accelerated. Something had shifted in the last 48 hours in the structure of their agreement, and the scout this morning had confirmed it for Vasquez. That Kael had a pressure point, that the pressure point was accessible, that it was worth testing. "You said you were going to make the rational play," she said. "I was going to. Tonight." Tonight was too late. He didn't answer that. There was no answer for it. "Where are we?" she asked. "My building. I have a unit here. Not my primary residence. No one outside my immediate circle knows about it." She looked at the concrete walls of the parking structure. "How immediate?" "3 people." She absorbed that. "Okay." She undid her seatbelt. "Then let's go inside." The unit was on the 14th floor, and it was nothing like what she'd imagined for him, which she hadn't entirely admitted to imagining. It was spare, not empty, but minimal, the furniture functional and well-made, the kind of place that looked like it was used for thinking rather than living. One wall of windows looked out over the South Loop toward the lake, which in the dark was a massive absence, a place where the city lights ended. There was a desk, a kitchen that had clearly not been cooked in recently, no art on the walls, no photographs. She stood in the middle of it and took it in and thought, this is what it looks like inside, isn't it? The version of him no one sees, just the windows and the city, and no softness anywhere because he never needed softness here, never had anyone to be soft with. She turned around and he was standing near the door watching her take inventory of his sparse private life with the expression of a man waiting to be told what it meant. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the couch. She sat in the chair that faced it, the same arrangement as her kitchen table, almost. She thought about how many important conversations they had conducted in parallel lines across small pieces of furniture. "Tell me about your inner circle," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because Vasquez moved in 48 hours. Something changed in his calculation. You said you don't know what." She held his gaze. "But I think you have a guess." The silence was very specific in its texture. She felt it in her sternum. "Tell me," she said. "There are 3 people who know about you," he said slowly, "know about what you are to me, in any specific terms." A pause. "Jin Ho. He's been with me for 8 years. He runs operations." Another pause. "Seo Yan. She handles my financial structure, 12 years. He stopped. "That's 2, Talia said. He was looking at this window. "Damien Cross. He manages my external relationships, including the Vasquez arrangement." Something in how he said the last name made her very still. When did the timeline shift? She asked carefully. When did Vasquez's behavior change, and how recently? Cale's jaw moved once. 6 days ago. And when did Damien Cross last have specific information about me? The silence stretched. Kael. 8 days ago, he said, very quiet, very flat. She watched something happen in him that she had never seen before. Not rage. Nothing as clean as rage. Something beneath it, the specific devastation of a person who has kept their world locked down and controlled and trusted almost no one, and now has to reckon with what trust actually cost. She saw it move through him the way weather moves through a landscape, ground level, changing everything it touched. You don't know yet, she said. You need to verify. Yes? But you believe it. A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. Kael, do you believe Damien Cross told Vasquez about me? Yes, he said. I believe that. She sat with it, the weight of it. A man who had given his loyalty and his information and his proximity to someone for years, and that person had taken the one thing that could be used against him and handed it to his enemy. She thought about what that meant in the specific economy of trust that Kael operated in, where trust was rare and costly and calibrated to the millimeter, and to have that calculation be wrong. How long? She asked. I don't know. His voice had gone to that cold even register that she now understood was not absence of feeling but the sound of too much of it being held under pressure. That's what I don't know. Could it be longer than 8 days? It could be a great deal longer than 8 days. She stood up. Not out of agitation. She needed to be on her feet for the next part of this. What has Cross had access to? Everything, Kael said, and the word came out like something that had been dropped from a great height. He has managed my external relationships for 7 years. He would have everything, every agreement, every leverage point, every weakness. A pause that was barely a pause. Every arrangement I have that depends on the other side not knowing the full picture. Which means Vasquez doesn't just know about me. Kael looked at her. No. Vasquez has been operating with intelligence about your full structure for potentially years. Yes. Which means the agreements you thought were stable may have been managed from the other side for longer than I know. He said it steadily, and it cost him visibly to say it steadily. Which means every position I believed I held from strength, I may have been allowed to hold. The room was quiet. Talia pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Not from distress, from the effort of thinking clearly in a situation that was trying very hard to prevent that. She was a trauma nurse. She triaged. She identified what was dying fastest and worked on that first and left the stable injuries for later. She applied that now. Where's Cross right now? She asked. I don't know. He hasn't responded to contact in 6 hours. Is that unusual? For Damien Cross, yes. He was responsive. Always responsive. The past tense landed. He had already processed it to past tense, which told her something about how fast his mind worked in damage assessment mode, and also told her something about the specific damage being done right now, in this quiet room, to the person beneath the system's manager. He's gone, she said. Not a question. Yes. To Vasquez. Most likely. She sat back down, not in the chair, on the couch beside him, which broke the parallel lines arrangement they'd always maintained and put her 3 feet from him in the same plane, and she felt him register that without moving or speaking. Okay, she said. Here's what I know. Vasquez has compromised intelligence on your full structure. Cross has defected. You have enemies who now know you have a vulnerability. Your inner circle is now effectively 2 people whose loyalty you still trust. She paused. What does Vasquez need that he doesn't currently have? Kael looked at her. He has the intelligence, she said. What does the intelligence not give him? A silence. Then, slowly, the network itself. Knowing the structure doesn't give him the relationships, the trust that's been built inside it. A pause. The code-level access to certain financial instruments that are only accessible through biometric confirmation, which he needs you alive for. For the moment, yes. Which is why tonight was positioning, not an execution. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You understand this quickly. I grew up 4 blocks from this. I've been watching how power moves in this city my whole life from the outside.
She held his gaze. Now I'm watching it from the inside, and it's the same architecture. It's always the same architecture. Someone builds something. Someone else waits until the builder cares about something enough to make them controllable. He was very still. He's going to come for me, she said. Not to hurt me, to use me. Yes. As leverage to get what he needs from you.
Yes.
She looked at her own hands for a moment. The hands that had dragged him through the snow 2 months ago, that had taken his pulse on a frozen street, that had pressed warmth back into cold skin because walking past was not a thing she had in her to do. Those same hands, now located inside a problem she hadn't created and couldn't fully see the edges of.
She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about his kids, the youngest with the crayon drawing of the yellow door. She thought about the specific unfairness of the world, not as a complaint, but as a fact, the way the trauma bay had taught her. The world was not fair. People died who should have lived. The math wasn't moral. What you could do was show up and work with what was in front of you, and not pretend the blood wasn't there. Kael, she said. Yes. How bad is it, honestly? He was quiet for a long moment. Worse than I've experienced before, he said. Not insurmountable, but I will need to dismantle and rebuild my external relationships from zero. That will take time. During that time, I am exposed in ways I have not been exposed since I was building this in the first place. He paused. And during that time, you are the most efficient way to control me. So either I disappear somewhere Vasquez can't find me, she said, or you deal with Vasquez directly before he can operationalize what he knows. Yes. How much time do we have before he moves from positioning to action? Days? Maybe less, now that the scout was made. He knows we ran. Yes. She nodded once, stood up again, went to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the city. Chicago at 11 p.m. was still fully alive, the grid of it laid out below her in moving light, the same city it had always been, indifferent and enormous, and full of people who knew nothing about any of this. She thought about Deja, who was going to get into that STEM program. She thought about Marcus, 15, who wanted to study mechanical engineering and had a laugh that was running a little low lately, but was still there. She thought about the free clinic she'd been drafting a business plan for on the back of nursing journals for 3 years, the one she hadn't told anyone about except her grandmother's ghost, and once, late on a phone call, Kael. She turned around. I'm not disappearing, she said. He looked at her from the couch. Talia, I'm not going to run and hide and let you handle this while I sit somewhere waiting to find out what version of my life I get to come back to. She kept her voice even. It took work. That's not a choice I'm making. It's the safest. Safe is a thing I stopped being precious about a long time ago. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and made him look up at her and hold her eyes. I want to know everything, not the managed version, not what you think I can handle. Everything. Vasquez, Cross, what Cross gave him, what agreements are compromised, what leverage you have left. All of it. His jaw was tight. I'm not going to be useful to either of us if I'm working with partial information, she said. And you need me to be useful, Kael, because your circle just went from 3 people to 2, and I've been on the outside of your world looking at it clearly enough to see things you're too inside it to see. You said it yourself. I understand quickly. She paused. So let me understand. The look on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not the controlled surface, not the cold efficiency, not even the careful, almost smile that she'd come to catalog like something precious. This was rawer than all of that. This was a man standing at the exact edge of the way he had survived for 11 years and being asked to step off it. He looked at her for a long time. Then he started talking. He talked for 2 hours. She sat across from him and listened the way she'd been listening since the first night, fully, without performing. He told her about the structure, the corridors and the agreements and the money channels and the pressure points and the names she didn't know and the arrangements that had been in place since before she knew he existed. He told her about Cross, the 7 years, the access, the specific moments now recontextualizing themselves in his mind as he spoke, the small things that made a new shape when he turned them over. He told her about Vasquez, the history of the agreement, the nature of it, what Vasquez had always wanted, and why the current arrangement had never given it to him fully. She asked questions. Specific ones. The kind that came from listening rather than waiting. He answered them without deflecting, which she knew cost him, because every answer was a brick removed from the wall he had built around everything he was. At 1:30 in the morning, she got up and made tea in his empty kitchen because her body needed to do something, and she stood at the counter waiting for the kettle and thought about what she now knew and what shape it made. The shape was not good. The shape was the particular shape of a problem where all the fast solutions were wrong and all the right solutions were slow, and the enemy was operating on a faster timeline. She brought the tea back. He took his mug and wrapped both hands around it the same way he had the first night in her apartment, and she sat down and looked at him. "Tell me about Cross," she said. "Not the logistics. Him." Kyle looked at his tea. He was effective. He understood relationships the way I understood systems. He could walk into a room and come out with an agreement I couldn't have built. A pause. I trusted him with things I don't trust easily. Did you like him? A silence. I don't. He stopped. Yes, in the way that I. Another stop. He was the closest thing to a friend I've had inside this. The admission was quiet and devastating in its quietness. I'm sorry, she said. He looked up. Don't. I'm saying it anyway. She held his gaze. Losing someone you trusted at that level, regardless of what they did, that's a specific kind of pain. You don't have to not feel it. His expression shifted, something pulling against the surface of it, and he looked away. Not because he disagreed, because he wasn't ready to sit with it directly yet, and she understood that and didn't push. What would Cross have told Vasquez about your leverage over the Northwest Corridor, she asked, shifting back to practical. He answered. They worked through it systematically for another hour, her asking and him laying it out and both of them mapping the shape of it, and gradually something began to emerge from the mapping that neither of them had been able to see from inside their separate positions. She saw it first. The pharmaceutical distribution arrangement, she said. Cross managed that relationship directly. Yes. And it runs through 3 legitimate businesses that Vasquez has no direct line into. Correct. So if Cross gave Vasquez the intelligence on the financial structure, but Vasquez hasn't moved to consolidate those channels yet, then he either doesn't understand the value of them or he's waiting to secure them until he has a position of control over me. He looked at her with sharpening attention. Which means they're still intact. Which means they're leverage you still actually have. Yes. He was sitting forward now. Yes. So Vasquez doesn't have everything, she said. He has enough to make you feel exposed. But the specific channels that would let him actually replace you, rather than just destabilize you, he doesn't have those. Cross knew about them. But the relationships inside them are personal. They don't transfer. They don't transfer, he said, and something moved in his eyes that was not hope exactly, but was the functional relative of it, the recalculation of a man who has found a foothold. She watched him sit with it, the way his shoulders shifted, the way his hands finally uncurled from around the mug and went flat on his thighs, not in defeat, but in the specific stillness of someone who has found the frame of a plan. I need 2 days, he said. To do what? To rebuild the 3 contacts that matter most, to find Damian Cross, and to structure a conversation with Vasquez that comes from a position of something other than reaction. He paused. Can you stay here for 2 days? She looked at the spare room she hadn't been in yet. She thought about her hospital shifts. She was off tomorrow, back the day after. She thought about the community center, the nursing journals on her kitchen table, the crossword puzzle she'd been doing in pieces for weeks. She thought about a man who had just spent 2 hours dismantling every wall he'd ever built, brick by brick, across a kitchen table, because she asked him to. Yes, she said. He nodded once. There was gratitude in it, of the specific kind that doesn't know how to perform itself, and so just exists, plainly, in the set of a jaw and the quality of a held look. She was almost to the spare room doorway when his phone rang. Not the personal cell, the other one. The one he kept in the left interior pocket that she had learned existed but had never heard ring before. He looked at the screen and something happened in his face that she saw from across the room and that stopped her completely. What is it? She said. He answered the call. He said nothing, just listened. She watched his face and counted the seconds, and at the 5th second something happened in it that she had no vocabulary for, a rupture beneath the surface of him so complete that the controlled exterior simply couldn't hold it, the way a building can't hold an earthquake. His face went to a place she had never seen it go. At 8 seconds, he ended the call. He stood in his bare, sparse apartment with the city laid out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and he looked at her, and his eyes were what they looked like when everything had already happened and the body hadn't caught up yet. "They found Damien Cross," he said. She waited. "He's dead." A pause. "He's been dead for 6 days." The room was absolutely still. "Before he told Vasquez anything," Kyle said, his voice coming from somewhere she'd never heard it come from before. "Before any of this." Another pause, each word arriving separately, like something being reconstructed from wreckage. "Vasquez killed him 6 days ago to keep the intelligence contained, to keep it clean." She stood in the doorway. "Vasquez doesn't have Cross's information," Kyle said. "He never did. Cross was approached and refused, and Vasquez had him killed to prevent him from warning me." His hands were at his sides, and his voice was doing the thing it did when he was holding everything below a certain line by pure force. But the line was lower than she had ever seen it, and what was showing above it was grief, uncomplicated and unmistakable. "He didn't betray me." The silence between them was enormous. "Kyle, which means Vasquez found out about you some other way." He looked at her and through her and past her to whatever calculation was rearranging itself behind his eyes. "Which means there is still someone inside my circle that I haven't identified. Someone with access. Someone who has been in place before tonight, before Cross, before—" He stopped. She watched the thing move through him. "Before us," he said. And in that word, that simple plural, was the full weight of what they had built in the space of 2 months and what it had cost and what it was going to cost. And Talia stood in the doorway of the spare room in a man's bare apartment above a city that had never once given either of them anything easy, and understood that the ground under all of it had shifted in a way that— The ground under all of it had shifted, and they both felt it move. Kyle stood in the middle of his bare apartment with his phone at his side and his face doing something she had never seen it do. Not breaking, not collapsing, but undergoing a kind of internal seismic event that expressed itself only in the finest details. The tendon in his jaw, the millimeter shift of his shoulders, the way his eyes had gone to a place behind the present moment and were working through something at a speed she couldn't follow. Damien Cross had refused. He had been approached, had refused, and had been killed for it 6 days ago. And in the time since then, Kyle had been building a case against a dead man who had died protecting him, and that knowledge was doing something to him that Talia was watching in real time and could not reach. She crossed the room, not slowly. She crossed it the way she moved in the trauma bay when someone needed a hand on them more than they needed anything else. Direct, no wasted motion. And she put both hands on the sides of his face and made him look at her. His eyes came back from wherever they had been. "He didn't betray you," she said. "Hold on to that." His hands came up and closed around her wrists, not removing them, just holding. His grip was tight, in the way of someone who needed something to press against. She felt his pulse at the base of his palm. Fast, working hard. "There's someone else," he said. The words came out with the particular flatness of a man who has done the math and does not like the answer. "I know. Someone who has been in place long enough to know about you." His eyes on hers were very steady and very bleak. "That is a short list." "How short?" "Jin Ho and Seo Yan." He said both names like they cost him something. "The only 2 people I still—" He stopped. She kept her hands where they were. "You don't know yet." "No." "Then we don't burn anything down until we know." She held his gaze. "You hear me?" His jaw moved once, then, "Yes." She stepped back and he let her wrists go. The apartment was cold in the way of spaces that weren't lived in enough to hold warmth, and she felt it now, the April draft from somewhere in the building's bones. She looked at his hands at his sides and thought about what it meant to be a man who had structured his entire world around not needing to trust anyone, and to have the architecture of that finally and completely fail. "Sit down," she said. "I need to think, and I can't do it while you're standing there looking like that." He sat. She stood at the window and looked out at the city and made herself slow her own heart rate down through the deliberate mechanism she'd built in residency. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 4 counts, feel the floor under your feet, and name 3 things you can see. The grid of Chicago below, the black absence of the lake, the red aircraft warning light blinking on a building 3 blocks east. She turned around. Vasquez knows about me, but not through Cross, she said. The surveillance on my building was positioned before tonight. You said the scout was this morning, which means Vasquez had my address before we ran. That's at least 24 hours of knowledge. Maybe more. Yes. Jinho and Xiaoyan both have access to your personal movements. Yes. Which one knew where your car was parked tonight? He looked at her for a long moment. Both. Which one coordinated the response when the scout was made this morning? Who did you call first? Something moved in his eyes. Jinho? She kept her voice even, and he responded, how? He sent 2 men to the perimeter. A pause. Who arrived 8 minutes after we left? 8 minutes from where? The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not empty, but full, overfull, packed with something he was working through in real time, and she was watching him work through it and knew better than to rush it. From a position that should have been 4 minutes away, he said. She said nothing. Jinho, he said. Quiet. Flat. The specific quiet of a thing being confirmed that you already knew and had been refusing to know. You don't know yet, she said again, not because she believed it, but because the next steps required that they be certain, and certainty required something more than the convergence of timelines. No, he said. I don't know yet. He stood up. He picked up the phone from the couch cushion where he'd set it. But I know how to find out. What happened in the next 40 minutes, she would replay later in the ordered way she replayed trauma resuscitations, step by step, decision by decision, assessing what was right and what could have been different. He made 3 calls, all short. She heard only his side and understood about half of it from context and filled in the rest from the expressions crossing his face. After the 3rd call, he set the phone down and stood very still for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her, and she knew before he said it. Jinho, he said, 8 months. 8 months. She did the math involuntarily. 8 months ago was August. She had met Kyle in February. 6 months before she existed in any picture of his life, someone inside his closest circle had already been positioned against him. This had never been about her. She had simply been the most recent useful piece of intelligence in a longer operation. Where is he now? She said. En route here. He doesn't know that I know. She looked at him. Kyle, I need to speak to him directly. That's not what I... She stopped, started again. Is that safe? No. Very simple, very honest. But I need to look at him. She understood that. She had stood at enough bedsides where the family needed to see the body, even when there was no practical reason to, because the brain required certain kinds of confirmation that data alone couldn't provide. She understood needing to look. I'm staying, she said. I'm staying in this room. I'm not going anywhere. If you send me somewhere else right now, you are making a decision about what I can handle without asking me, and we've been very clear about that. She held his gaze. I'll stay back, but I'm here. He looked at her for a long moment. Everything behind his eyes was moving at a speed she couldn't track, and she held his gaze steadily and waited. There's a room at the end of the hall, he said finally. Stay in it until I come for you. Door locked. Agreed. Talia. He said her name differently than he usually did. Lower, more deliberate, like he was pressing it into something. Whatever you hear, you stay in that room. She nodded. He held her eyes for one more second, and then he went to the door to wait. She went to the room at the end of the hall. She did not lock the door. She stood behind it with her hand on the frame and her ear toward the hall, and her heart doing something measured and deliberate in her chest. And she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and named 3 things she could feel. The door frame under her palm, the cold tile floor through her socks, the weight of the past 2 hours sitting in her sternum like a stone she'd decided to carry. Jinho arrived 12 minutes later. She heard the apartment door open. She heard footsteps. 2 sets, which meant Jinho had not come alone, which meant this was already not the conversation Kyle had framed it as. She pressed closer to the door. Their voices came through clearly enough. Jinho's she had heard once before, on a call she wasn't supposed to be listening to. A smooth voice, careful in its rhythms, the voice of someone who communicated in layers. You called me here, Jinho said. Not a question. I did, Kale's voice from somewhere near the center of the room. Alone, you said. I said come. I didn't specify. A pause. You found out about Cross. Not a question either. He was already in the open, which told her he had decided on a specific strategy before walking through the door. She didn't know enough about his world to parse whether that was confidence or calculation or desperation. Tell me how long, Kael said. Does it matter? Yes. A silence. Then, 11 months. Not 8. 11. Her throat tightened. Before Cross, Kael said, very quiet. Before Cross. Was Cross approached through you? A pause that told her the answer before Jinho gave it. Yes. And when he refused, that was Vasquez's decision, not mine. I want you to know that. I don't care whose decision it was. The temperature in Kael's voice had dropped to a register she hadn't heard before, not even in the parking structure, not even when he'd moved her away from the window. This was something below cold, something geological. Tell me what Vasquez has. Kael, tell me what he has. Another pause, longer. She imagined Jinho in the room, making the calculation all people made when the moment they'd been managing finally collapsed, whether to keep managing it or to put it down. He has the full external structure, Jinho said. Every agreement, every arrangement, every timeline. The Northwest Corridor, the financial channels, the pending consolidation in the River North territory. A pause. He has the names. All of them. All of them. The room was silent long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 7. Why? Kael said. Just that. A silence that was different from the others, not evasive, not calculating, something more tired. Because I am 43 years old, Jinho said, and I have spent 22 years inside this, and Vasquez offered me a way out, a real one, not a retirement, a life, somewhere that isn't this. A pause. I took it. You could have come to me and said what? I'm tired? I want to leave? Jinho's voice shifted, something surfacing in it that had been below the careful layers. You don't let people leave, Kael. You know you don't. They stay because it's the safest place to be, which means it's also a cage. I've been in that cage for 22 years. She heard Kael absorb that. She felt it from behind the door. The quality of silence that meant something true and painful had been said, and the person hearing it knew it was true. What does Vasquez want? Kael said finally. The financial channels, the biometric access, your signature on a restructuring agreement that transfers operational control of the South and West corridors. In exchange for what? Your life, Talia Mercer's safety, and my retirement. A pause. He's not trying to destroy you, Kael. He's trying to acquire you. The difference being, alive and controlled versus dead and replaced. The silence after that was absolute. She was aware of her own breathing against the door, keeping it slow and even, and of the cold floor under her feet, and the weight of the stone in her chest, and the particular quality of a situation that had passed the point where any outcome was clean. She heard something then, a sound she couldn't place immediately, and then placed with a cold clarity, the distinctive sound of the second set of footsteps. Jinho's companion, who had been silent until now, moving, repositioning. She opened the door. She came into the hallway at the same moment the other man moved into her sight line from the living room. Younger than Jinho, somewhere around 30, with the flat expression of someone performing a function. And she saw Kael register her arrival, and the second man register her arrival, and the room redistribute itself around this new variable in real time. Talia. Kael's voice was controlled and very tense. I heard enough, she said. She was looking at Jinho. He was looking back at her. She had never seen him before. Medium height, lean, a face that had been careful for so long that carefulness had become its permanent expression. He looked at her with something that she did not expect, which was recognition, not of her specifically, of what she represented. You're why he didn't see it earlier, Jinho said. Not cruel, almost observational. He was paying attention to you. Yes, she said. He was. I'm not angry at you for that. I don't need you to not be angry at me, she said. I need to know what Vasquez's timeline is. Jinho looked at her for a moment, then at Kael, then back at her. 48 hours. He wants a meeting. Neutral location. Kael comes, signs the transfer documentation, the agreement is structured. And if Kyle doesn't come, then the names go to the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road. A pause. All of them, full dossier. Enough to bring down the entire structure in 30 days. The room held that for a moment. Talia looked at Kyle. He was looking at Jinho with an expression that she finally had a word for. Grief that had made peace with itself. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the particular stillness of someone who has looked at something terrible and decided to stop being surprised by it. Get him out, Kale said to the second man, quietly. Both of you, now. Jinho stood for a moment. He looked at Kyle, and in his face was something that might have been shame, or might have been the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a decision for 11 months and was finally done with the weight of it. He left without another word. The second man followed. The apartment door closed. Talia and Kyle stood in the living room in the aftermath of it, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. The city was still out there beyond the glass. Still moving, still indifferent. She looked at his profile against the window and thought about 22 years, and cages, and the specific arithmetic of loyalty in a world where the cost of leaving was as high as the cost of staying. Are you all right? She said. No. Very flat, very honest. Okay. She went to the kitchen and got water, 2 glasses, the simple logistics of bodies that had been running on adrenaline for 3 hours and needed hydration regardless of the emotional landscape. She brought them back and handed him one, and he took it and she drank, and they stood side by side at the window and looked at the city. 48 hours, she said. Yes. And if you go to the meeting and sign what he's asking for. I lose the structure I've spent 11 years building. He paused. But we're alive, and the names stay buried. And if you don't go, the FBI dossier destroys everything regardless. I face charges, and so do 23 people whose involvement was not voluntary. His jaw tightened. People who worked for me because they had no other option. People I pulled out of exactly the situations that would have swallowed Marcus on his block. She looked at him. I am not a good man, he said quietly. I have never pretended to be. But I am responsible for things beyond my own survival. He paused. The dossier option is not an option I can choose. So you meet Vasquez. So I meet Vasquez. And you sign. He said nothing. She felt the thing he wasn't saying, the third option, the one he hadn't put on the table, the one that had been in the room since Jinho said Vasquez wants to acquire you. The option that was not meeting and not refusing, but something else entirely. Kyle, she said. Yes. What are you thinking? He turned and looked at her, and the planning architecture in his eyes was fully engaged, running at a temperature she could almost feel. I'm thinking, he said carefully, that Vasquez has made a structural error. She waited. He needs my biometric access and my signature, Kyle said, which means he needs me cooperative, which means he cannot afford a confrontation before the meeting. 48 hours of safe passage. Effectively, yes. And in 48 hours. In 48 hours, Vasquez is expecting a broken man who has run out of options to walk into a room and sign away everything. He paused. He's not expecting the full inventory of what I still have. She thought about what she knew. The financial channels, the personal relationships that didn't transfer, the specific leverage that Cross had died to protect. The foothold. The pharmaceutical distribution arrangement, she said. He looked at her. The relationship is personal, not transferable, you said. Vasquez has the intelligence on the structure, but not the actual relationship. She was thinking out loud now, the way she thought through complicated cases. Aloud, step by step, following the logic wherever it went. If you spend the next 48 hours rebuilding that relationship into a shield rather than just a channel, making it public enough that Vasquez acquiring it requires their consent rather than just your signature, then the acquisition becomes a negotiation, not an ultimatum. His voice had changed. Something was moving in it, beneath the controlled surface. If the 3 key external partners agree to a restructuring that distributes the operational nodes, then Vasquez gets less than he thinks he's getting, even if you sign. And the dossier threat loses its teeth because the structure it describes no longer exists in the form he documented. She looked at him. He was looking at her. The window was behind him, and the city was behind the window, and everything that had happened in the last 4 hours was still present in the room,
but it had shifted from weight to fuel, and she felt that shift in both of them simultaneously, the specific transition from survival mode to something that required more than survival. "You'd need to make 3 calls tonight," she said. "Before dawn." "Yes, and I need to make one." He looked at her carefully. "Who?" "Deja's STEM program director. He owes me a referral favor I haven't used." She held his gaze. "One of the pharmaceutical distribution partners. They have a legitimate subsidiary in the biotech space. You need a meeting with the right person, and I can get you in the room. They'll trust a nursing referral in a way they won't trust a cold call." He stared at her. "I told you," she said. "I'm not a liability. Stop looking at me like one." Something broke open in his face then. Not the grief, and not the calculation, and not the controlled surface. Something underneath all of it. Something she had been watching approach from a distance for 2 months, the way you watch a weather system moving across the lake, knowing it was coming and still not entirely ready for it when it arrived. He crossed the distance between them and put both arms around her and pulled her in and held on, and she felt the full weight of him. Not physically, though that too, but the weight of 11 years and 22 years, and the cage Jin Ho had named, and the quilt on a February couch, and every late-night call, and every carefully extracted piece of honesty. And she put her arms around him and held back, and they stood in the window light of a city that had never given either of them anything easy, and stayed there for a long moment. His heart was going fast under her ear. She could feel it working. "I've got you," she said. He said nothing. He held on. She felt his breathing change, slower, deeper, the specific physiological shift of a body beginning to believe it was not alone in the thing it was carrying. She had seen it in patients and had never seen it in him before, and she held very still and let it happen. After a while, he pulled back and looked at her face. "I need to make the calls," he said. "I know." He kept looking at her for a moment. His hands were on her shoulders, and his eyes were something she had no clean language for. Only the knowledge that she had dragged this man through the snow 2 months ago, and whatever had been dying in him then was not dead anymore. "After," he said. "I need to tell you." "After," she agreed. "Make the calls." He went. She sat at the bare desk with her own phone and composed the message to the STEM director, and sent it, and sat back and looked at the ceiling, and breathed. The stone in her chest was still there. It would be there for a while. But it had shifted from the weight of something falling to the weight of something held, and there was a difference. And she knew the difference. His voice from the living room, low and rapid and precise, making the first call. Outside, Chicago was beginning to go toward the thin gray that preceded dawn. The lake was still black. The aircraft lights still blinked east. Somewhere on the south side, in the community center on 63rd Street, the lights were off, and the building was quiet, and a 15-year-old who wanted to study mechanical engineering was somewhere in a house that might or might not have margin for error, sleeping or not sleeping, still on the right side of a line that the next few days were going to matter for. Her phone buzzed. The STEM director responding at 4:30 a.m. because he kept impossible hours, and she had always liked him for it. "Biotech subsidiary. Yes, I know the right person." "What's the context?" She typed back, "Restructuring conversation. Legitimate. High stakes on both sides. The person coming to the table is serious and will be worth their time." A pause. Then, "I need this tomorrow, not next week." 3 dots. Then, "I'll make the call at 7 a.m. Have your person ready." She set the phone down. From the living room, Kael was on the second call. She could hear the difference in register. This one was longer, more complex, the voice on his end requiring more work. She let it be. She trusted him in this space the way she trusted competent colleagues in the Bay, present, not hovering, available when needed. Her phone buzzed again. Different number. Unknown. She looked at it for a long moment. She answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried, and she had never heard it before and knew immediately who it was. "Miss Mercer," said Dario Vasquez. "I apologize for the hour." She said nothing. She stood up. "I wanted to have a conversation without intermediaries," he said. "I find they complicate things." A pause. "I believe you are a woman who understands pragmatism. Working in emergency medicine requires it." "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing I've always wanted, a stable arrangement." His voice had the quality of a man who spent very little time being in positions of uncertainty. "I want you to understand that my issue is not with you personally.
And my offer stands regardless of what Kyle Han decides to do in the next 48 hours. Your offer,
Your life, exactly as it is.
the clinic you want to open, the community center, the students you care about, all of it untouched. A pause. In exchange for his signature. You're calling me, she said, because you know he won't give it to you for himself. You think he'll give it to you for me. A slight pause. As I said, a pragmatic woman. She looked at the door to the living room. Through it, she could hear Kyle still on his call, the low, precise cadence of a man building something from scratch in a narrow window of time. You made a mistake, she said. Did I? You assumed I would be the thing that breaks him. She kept her voice even. 14 years of delivering impossible news had given her a voice that did not shake in the moments when it counted. You're wrong about what I am to him. And what are you to him? The reason he doesn't break. She paused. Don't call this number again. She ended the call. Her hands were steady. She noted that with the same clinical detachment, she noted everything in high-pressure moments. Heart rate elevated but controlled, hands steady, thinking clear. She walked to the living room doorway. Cale was on the third call. He looked up when she appeared and read her face in the way he had learned to read her, quickly and completely, and she watched him read it, and she held up one finger and mouthed, Vasquez. Called me directly. She watched his expression shift. She held up a second finger and mouthed, I handled it. His jaw tightened once. Then something gave slightly in it, and he looked at her with an expression that was, under everything else, something close to wonder. She leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms and waited for him to finish. The third call ended at 5:12 a.m. He set the phone down. The biotech contact comes through at 7, she said. You have 90 minutes. He looked at her. Vasquez called you. Yes. What did he say? That he'd leave my life alone if you signed. And? I told him he was wrong about what I am to you. Cale stood very still in the pre-dawn quiet of his bare apartment. The city behind him was going from black to gray, the first suggestion of light touching the tops of the buildings east. His face, in that light, was exhausted and precise and entirely without the walls she had met him behind. What are you to me? He said. Quietly, not performing the question. She looked at him straight on. I'm the person standing in this room at 5 in the morning, helping you take apart a man who thought he could use me against you. She paused. I'm the person who isn't going anywhere. He crossed the room to her. He put his hand against the side of her face, and she turned into it. And they stood like that in the gray early morning light with everything that had been said and decided and survived between them. And she felt his thumb trace her cheekbone once, slow and deliberate, the way you touch something you have been afraid of losing. When this is over, he said. When this is over, she agreed. His phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't move immediately. He kept his eyes on hers for one more second. Then he picked it up. The message on screen was 4 words from a contact labeled only with an initial, a confirmation from the third external partner, the last piece of the structure he'd been rebuilding through the night, the final element of the play that would walk into Vasquez's meeting in 36 hours and take apart his ultimatum from the inside. He turned the screen so she could see it. She read it. She exhaled. It's enough, she said. It might be enough, he said. The distinction was precise, and she respected it. Then let's make sure it is. She pushed off the doorframe. I need coffee, and I need the full layout of what the meeting looks like, and I need to know exactly what Vasquez's tells are when he starts to realize the position has changed. He looked at her for a moment. You're going to be in the meeting. I'm going to be somewhere he can reach me. There's a difference. She met his eyes. He's going to look for me in that room. Whether I'm there physically or whether you have a live line to me during, he's going to try to use the fact that I exist as a pressure point. The only way to neutralize that is if the pressure point becomes something other than a vulnerability. Meaning, if he looks for me and finds someone who walked in knowing everything and chose to be there, it's not a weakness anymore. She held his gaze. It's a statement. He looked at her for a long moment. In his face was the specific expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life making calculations alone and is encountering, for the first time, the particular mathematics of not having to. The meeting is at a warehouse on the Calumet River, he said. Vasquez's territory. He'll have men stationed in the loading corridor and on the river approach. He paused. He won't expect you there. No, she said. He won't. Outside the window, the sun was beginning its argument with the Chicago skyline, throwing the first long shadows off the buildings eastward, the city reassembling itself out of the dark the way it did every morning, indifferent to what had happened in the hours before, already running forward on its own logic. Inside the apartment, Talia Mercer put on the kettle and Kyle Hahn spread the building schematic across his desk, and they worked, side by side, in the thin early light, building the thing that was going to walk into that warehouse and change what Dario Vasquez believed he was holding. 34 hours later, they were in the car approaching the Calumet River. The sky had gone the heavy pre-storm gray of late April, the kind that felt like pressure, the city flattening itself beneath it. Kyle drove. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her heartbeat steady in the specific way of someone who has committed to a decision and stopped reconsidering it. The warehouse district along the river was industrial and enormous and mostly quiet on a Sunday morning, the loading docks empty, the cranes motionless. He has 12 men inside, Kyle said. We confirmed that this morning. And Jinho? Jinho is not present. Vasquez moved him out of Chicago 48 hours ago. A pause. Which means Vasquez is not expecting a problem today. Good. The three partners have confirmed their positions. The restructuring documentation is filed and distributed. If Vasquez moves against either of us today, the distribution goes public within the hour. He paused. He doesn't know that yet. He will in about 8 minutes, she said. He looked at her sidelong. Something moved in his expression. How are you? Good. She looked forward through the windshield at the gray river and the gray sky and the dark shape of the warehouse 200 meters ahead. How are you? Good, he said. Neither of them believed it entirely, and both of them believed it enough, which was, she had come to understand, the only functional definition of ready. The car pulled up to the warehouse entrance. 2 men at the door, eyes moving to the car and to her. She saw them register her presence, saw the adjustment in their posture, the flicker of something that went inside the building faster than she could track. Vasquez had not been expecting her. Kyle got out. She got out. They walked toward the door side by side, and she felt the cold coming off the river and the weight of the stone in her chest, which was not fear but was the closest thing to it that she had decided to carry today. And she thought about Marcus Webb's kids and the yellow door and Deja, who was going to become something extraordinary, and Marcus, who wanted to study mechanical engineering, and the clinic that was still a business plan on the back of nursing journals, but would not always be. The doors opened. The interior of the warehouse was vast and cold and smelled of river water and metal, and something chemical underneath. Vasquez was standing 50 feet in, flanked by 4 men, the others positioned along the walls in the way of people who had been told to look casual and couldn't quite manage it. He was younger than she had expected, early 50s, compact, a face that had been pleasant once and had been arranged over the years into something more deliberately neutral. He looked at her, then at Kyle, then back at her. She watched him recalculate. She watched the comfortable certainty of a man who had spent 48 hours holding an ultimatum begin to develop the first hairline fracture. Kyle stopped walking 15 feet from him. You brought her, Vasquez said. She came, Kyle said. Vasquez looked at her. Ms. Mercer. His voice was still smooth, still controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it now, the faint frequency of a man who has walked into a room that is not quite the room he prepared for. This doesn't involve you. You called my personal phone at 4:30 this morning, she said. You've had surveillance on my building. You sent a man to my hospital parking structure. She held his gaze. I think you'll find it does involve me. His eyes moved to Kyle. Kyle reached into his interior coat pocket and removed a single folded document and held it out. Vasquez's man took it. Vasquez unfolded it. His eyes moved down the page, and she watched them move. And she watched the moment. The exact moment, she could identify it down to the second, when he understood what he was looking at. Not a signature, not a transfer agreement, a restructuring document already filed, already distributed, already public, with 3 names on it that were not Kyle Hahn's and not Dario Vasquez's, and which had been in place for 18 hours. The room was very still. Vasquez looked up. The structure you purchased intelligence on, Kyle said, no longer exists in the form you documented. His voice was the low, precise register she now knew meant he had been planning this sentence for 34 hours. The financial channels are distributed across 3 independent nodes whose cooperation you cannot compel and whose relationships are personal, not transferable, and publicly formalized as of yesterday afternoon. He paused. Your dossier describes a system that is no longer operational. Vasquez was looking at the document. His jaw had done something small and controlled, and she watched the 4 men around him feel the shift without understanding it, the way subordinates always felt the change in temperature before they knew what had changed. The FBI filing, Vasquez said, would result in an investigation of a structure that has been voluntarily restructured and reported to 3 separate regulatory bodies in the last 18 hours. Kael's voice was flat. The men whose names appear in your dossier have already been formally separated from any operational role. The filing would be 2 years of expensive litigation and would produce nothing you could leverage. You can't have done this in 48 hours. I did it in 34. A pause. I had help. Vasquez looked at her. She said nothing. She let him look. This isn't over, Vasquez said quietly. It is, Kael said. Here's what you have. The Northwest Corridor arrangement, unchanged. Your current operational territory, untouched. And your life, which you still have because I chose to walk in here instead of choosing something else. He paused. What you don't have is leverage over me. You never had it. You had intelligence on a structure that I dismantled before you could use it. He let that sit for a moment. We can continue this conversation, or we can conclude it. I am suggesting we conclude it. The warehouse was silent except for the sound of the river against the pilings outside. Vasquez stood with the document in his hands and looked at the man across from him and then at the woman beside that man, and she held his gaze without performance, without aggression, just the steady and undecorated gaze of someone who had been in rooms like this before. Not this kind of room, not these stakes, but the fundamental room, the one where someone is trying to decide whether to keep fighting or to put it down. And she knew the calculation he was running because she had watched it run in patients and in families, and in the community center kids, and in herself. And she knew which way it was going before his shoulders did the thing they did. He folded the document. He put it in his pocket. The Northwest arrangement stands, he said. Yes, Kael said. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them that she was not entirely privy to. The specific communication of 2 men who had operated in the same world for years and were now recalibrating what that world looked like going forward. Not friendship, not trust. Something more pragmatic and more honest than either. Your name is still in certain places, Vasquez said. As is yours, Kael replied. A silence. Then we understand each other, Vasquez said. He turned and walked toward the far end of the warehouse. His men followed, the positions along the wall dissolving, the room depressurizing in that specific way of a confrontation that has passed its peak without detonating. She watched them go. She stood in the cold warehouse with the smell of the river and the weight of the last 34 hours, and the stone in her chest, which was still there but was different now. Not falling, not held in suspension, but settled, placed, occupying exactly the space she had agreed to give it. Kael was beside her. Neither of them moved for a moment. It worked, she said. Yes. He exhaled once, a single controlled breath that told her more about the last 34 hours than anything he'd said aloud. It worked. She turned and looked at him in the flat gray light of the warehouse. His face was tired and precise and entirely present, the wall down, the calculation put away, just the man underneath all of it, standing in the cold in a building on the wrong side of the river on a Sunday morning in April that was threatening rain. We go home, she said. He looked at her. The almost smile moved through his expression, the rare one, the one she had been cataloging for months. Yes, he said, we can go home. They walked toward the door. Behind them, the warehouse settled into silence. Outside, the Chicago sky broke open, and the first rain of the day came down, hard and sudden and entirely without ceremony, and she walked out into it beside him, and neither of them ran. And the rain hit the river and the pavement and the rooftops of a city that kept moving no matter what happened inside it. And the stone in her chest was not gone, but it was hers, and she had chosen it, and she was not putting it down. Not now. Not for anything. The rain came down hard, palm hard on the drive back, not the gentle kind, Not the apologetic Chicago spring rain that arrived and left without conviction. This was a full-weight April downpour, the kind that turned the expressway into a mirror and made the city look like it was dissolving from the bottom up. And Kyle drove through it in silence, with both hands on the wheel and the wipers working hard, and Talia in the passenger seat watching the rain turn the south side into abstraction outside her window. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much, and they were both still metabolizing the morning. The warehouse, Vasquez's face when he read the document, the specific quality of a confrontation that ends not with explosion, but with the quiet deflation of a position that had no more ground to stand on. She had been in enough trauma resuscitations to know that the hardest part was never the crisis itself. The hardest part was the 10 minutes after, when the patient was stable and the adrenaline was still running and your hands were looking for something to do. She looked at her hands in her lap. Steady. She noted that the way she noted everything. "Tell me what you're thinking," Kyle said. She looked at the side of his face. "That it's not over." He was quiet for a moment. "No. Vasquez backed down today. That's real. But the structural exposure, the fact that someone inside your circle had access for 11 months, that the intelligence existed even if it doesn't have the teeth it once did, that doesn't disappear." "No," he said again. "It doesn't." "And Jin Ho." His hands adjusted on the wheel. "Jin Ho is in Vasquez's custody, presumably, or arrangement. I don't know the specifics of what he was promised." A pause. "I know what he was promised won't materialize the way he believed. Do you care about what happens to him?" The silence was long enough to be honest. "Yes," he said. "I don't want to, but yes." She looked back at the rain-dissolved city. 22 years is a long time to be in a cage with someone, she said, even if you're the one who built the cage. He said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. They got back to the South Loop building at 9:40 in the morning. She was aware of a bone-deep exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and was now arriving with the particular weight of a bill coming due. 2 nights of almost no sleep. The warehouse. Everything before the warehouse. She got out of the car and stood in the parking structure for a moment and just breathed. He came around and stood beside her. "Go upstairs," she said. "Sleep." "I have calls after you sleep." She looked at him. "You can run a restructured criminal organization on 6 hours. You cannot run it on none. Go upstairs." His mouth did the thing it did when he was not quite smiling but had decided to stop resisting the impulse. "You're going to keep doing this." "Telling you to take care of yourself?" "Yes. For the foreseeable future." He looked at her for a moment. "I need to say something to you." "I know." "You should let me say it." She crossed her arms. "Say it." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him assemble it. Not the words, she didn't think, but the willingness to let them leave his mouth in a way that couldn't be taken back. She had watched him manage this tendency over months, the habit of holding things internal until they became systems rather than feelings, and she waited without rushing it. "I should not have put you in that position," he said. "Any of it. The surveillance on your building, the man at your hospital, Vasquez calling your phone. Those things happened because I failed to manage my own exposure, and the cost fell on you." He paused. "I don't have a way to tell you that it won't happen again because I don't know that. My world is not predictable. It's not safe. And you deserve honesty about that more than you deserve my apologies for specifics." She held his gaze on, "I know your world isn't safe." "Yes. I walked into it with open eyes." "I know." He exhaled once. "That doesn't mean I don't carry what it costs." She uncrossed her arms. She stepped toward him and put her hand flat on his chest, over the left side, and felt his heartbeat under her palm, steadier than she would have expected, steady in the way of a body that had been trained to perform steadiness. "I know you carry it," she said. "I'm not asking you not to." She looked up at him. "I'm asking you to let me stand next to you while you do." He put his hand over hers. "Okay," he said. She felt the heartbeat under her palm. "Okay," she said. They went upstairs. She slept for 6 hours in the spare room, which was not as spare as she'd originally assessed. There was a wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed that she suspected had been placed there recently and deliberately, and the pillow was good, and she went under fast and came up 6 hours later to the smell of actual food, which was disorienting enough that she sat up in bed and blinked at the afternoon light coming through the blinds for a moment before she identified it. She followed the smell to the kitchen. Kyle was at the stove. He was wearing a t-shirt, and his expression had the particular quality of concentrated effort he brought to everything. She had once watched him sign documents with the same focus he apparently brought to cooking eggs, which made her smile now, privately, before he turned around. He turned around. "You cook," she said. "I told you I didn't." "You told me you ate the same 3 things. That's not the same thing." He looked back at the stove. "My grandmother taught me one dish. I've been making it for 30 years. She sat at the kitchen counter. "What is it?" "Doenjang jigai, fermented soybean paste stew." He adjusted something in the pot. She made it when she wanted to tell someone they were welcome somewhere. She didn't have language for warmth in the direct way. She cooked it instead. Talia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the back of him, the straight line of his shoulders, the economy of his movements at the stove, the t-shirt that was not the armor of the charcoal coat or the controlled precision of the suit. Just him, in a kitchen that was starting to smell like food, making the one dish his grandmother had given him. "When did she die?" she asked. "I was 20. A pause. "Before I built any of this. She never knew what I became." "Is that a relief or a grief?" He stirred the pot once. "Both, depending on the day." She nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. She understood that math completely. He set 2 bowls on the counter, rice on the side. She picked up the spoon and tasted it, and the warmth of it moved through her in a way that went past hunger, into something she didn't have a precise word for, the specific comfort of food made by someone who learned it as a language for care. "This is good," she said. "Yes," he said, without false modesty. "It is." They ate in the afternoon light of his kitchen, and for the first time in days, possibly in months, neither of them had anything urgent to say, and they didn't say it, and it was enough. The restructuring took 6 weeks to complete. She was not inside it exactly, and she was not outside it. She occupied a position that had no precedent in his world and no clean name. She was not a lieutenant, not a partner in the operational sense, not someone who managed anything or directed anyone. What she was, functionally, was the person who sat across from him at the end of each day and asked the questions no one else asked and heard the answers no one else heard and maintained the specific function of making the human being inside the operation visible to himself. She understood that was not a small thing. She had learned its weight in the trauma bay. The difference between a patient who had someone present and a patient who did not was measurable in outcomes, not just morale. The body kept better accounts when it was not alone. She had seen it so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it, and she applied the same understanding here without announcement. The 3 external partners held. The distributed structure that she and Kyle had built in 34 sleepless hours proved more durable than either of them had fully believed in the building of it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Each node operated with full knowledge of its own position and made its own choices within it. And that autonomy proved stickier than the centralized control it replaced, because people work harder to maintain something they own than something they're assigned. Kale told her this at the end of the 3rd week, sitting at his desk in the South Loop apartment with the restructuring document spread out and his eyes tired and his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who is surprised by his own conclusions. "You built it right the first time," she said. "I built it to survive," he said, "not to endure." "What's the difference?" He thought about it. Surviving is about the person at the center holding everything together. Enduring is about the structure being able to hold even when the center changes. He looked at the documents. "I've been the center for 11 years. Everything ran through me by design because I believed that was the only way to maintain control. And now the center is distributed. I'm part of it, not the whole of it." He paused. "It's uncomfortable. Because you can't control everything." "Yes." "Does it work better?" A silence. "Yes," he said. "It works better." She looked at him. "Good. Then be uncomfortable." He looked up at her with the almost smile that had become over months less almost and more itself. "You are extremely unsympathetic," he said. "I'm a trauma nurse. Unsympathetic is the job." She closed the folder she'd been reviewing. The clinic business plan, which had moved from the back of nursing journals to an actual document in the past 3 weeks. Also, you don't need sympathy right now. You need someone to tell you that giving up absolute control of something you built is not the same as losing it. He was quiet. It's not, she said. I know, he said. I'm working on believing it. I know you are. Seo-yeon came back in week 4. She appeared at Kale's door on a Thursday afternoon. She had been the one he'd sent away in the immediate aftermath of the Jin-ho revelation. Not out of suspicion, but out of the protective instinct of a man who had learned that proximity was its own kind of risk. She stood in the doorway of the South Loop apartment with the expression of a woman who had spent 4 weeks preparing for a conversation and was still not prepared for it. Talia was in the kitchen. She heard the door. She stayed in the kitchen. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She did not hear most of it. She heard enough. The cadences of it, the specific silences, the one moment when a voice that was not Kael's broke on something and then steadied. She boiled the kettle. She made 3 cups of tea. She carried 2 of them to the living room doorway and set them on the table inside without interrupting and went back to the kitchen. 40 minutes later, Kael came to find her. She's staying, he said. I know. He looked at her. You made tea. She's been with you for 12 years, Talia said, and she didn't sell you out. She has been sitting somewhere alone for 4 weeks not knowing whether she had a job or a life or any of the things she built alongside you. She held his gaze. She needed tea. He was quiet for a moment. You have never met her. I know what it feels like to wait to find out if you still have a place somewhere. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She picked up the 3rd mug. Go back in there. I'll come out when she's ready. She came out 20 minutes later and met Seo-yeon, who was a small and precise woman in her late 30s with eyes that had been crying recently and were now doing the work of not showing it, and who looked at Talia with an expression that tried to be neutral and wasn't. And Talia looked back at her with the same even, undecorated steadiness she gave everyone. He talked about you, Seo-yeon said. The first thing she said. What did he say? A pause. That you didn't walk past. Talia held her gaze. No, she said. I didn't. Seo-yeon looked at her for another moment, and whatever she was measuring, she apparently found it adequate because something settled in her face and she nodded once and picked up her tea. Marcus got into the IIT Saturday program in mid-May. He came to the community center on a Tuesday evening with the acceptance letter on his phone, which he showed to Talia with the careful casualness of a 15-year-old who desperately wanted to not seem excited and was failing completely at it. She looked at the letter and looked at his face doing its failing at casual act and felt something open up in her chest that was not complicated at all. I knew, she said. You didn't know. I did. You described the internal combustion engine for 12 minutes. That's not a person who isn't going to get into an engineering program. He looked at the floor. The laugh that ran at full capacity now. The good one. The one that wasn't being managed. Ms. Mercer? Marcus. Is it weird that I want to do this, like, from here? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It's not weird. It's the least weird thing in the world. Where you're from is not a ceiling. She paused. You know that. He looked up. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to. She texted Kael that night. Marcus got in. The reply came in under a minute. I know. The program director called me. A pause, then, he wanted to know if there were others. She stared at the phone, then she typed, You're unbelievable. The program has capacity for 3 more students from the 63rd Street catchment. Kael, I'm asking. This is me asking. She laughed in her empty apartment, the one she had been spending less time in, the crossword puzzle on the kitchen table still unfinished, but less urgently so. She typed back, Yes, there are 3 others. Come to the center Thursday and I'll introduce you. A longer pause than usual. Then, you want me to come to the community center. I want you to come to the community center. As yourself, she typed. Kael Han, who grew up with nothing in a city that didn't care about him and built something from zero and is currently funding engineering programs for teenagers on the South Side. You can leave the SUVs at home. The pause this time was long enough that she thought he might not respond. Then, Thursday. She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about how the most fundamental changes in people were almost never the dramatic ones. They were the small choices, repeated. To show up, to be seen, to walk into a community center on a Thursday evening without armor and let a 15-year-old show you an acceptance letter on his phone. He came on Thursday. He arrived alone in the gray hoodie she had once accidentally put in a load of laundry and that he had never retrieved, and that had apparently become, in the interim, his costume for being a person rather than a position. He stood in the doorway of the community center homework room for a moment, looking like exactly what he was. A man who had not been in a room like this since he was a child, in a context that had no protocol he recognized, and who had decided to come anyway. Marcus saw him first. "That's your guy?" he said to Talia quietly. "That's my guy," she said. Marcus looked him over with the specific assessment of a 15-year-old who has already learned to read men quickly and accurately as a survival skill. "He looks like he doesn't smile much." "He's learning," she said. Marcus went over to him. She watched from across the room. The boy with the good laugh, and the mechanical engineering dreams, and the man who had built an empire from nothing and was in the process of deciding what to do with it next. And the particular awkward and genuine negotiation of two people finding each other across every difference of age and world and experience through the shared language of someone both of them trusted. Kael crouched down, actually crouched, so they were at the same level. And she saw Marcus show him something on his phone, something technical. And she saw Kael look at it and say something back that made Marcus straighten up with that expression that teenagers wore when an adult had just treated their knowledge like it was real. She looked away before she started crying in a homework room, which would have been undignified. The clinic paperwork went through in the last week of May. It had been in process for 3 weeks by then, moving through the city's licensing and zoning channels with a speed that she suspected had a quiet hand behind it somewhere, but that she had decided, upon reflection, to not look at too carefully. The funding had come through an anonymous health nonprofit with a board she didn't know and couldn't trace, which was an arrangement she had negotiated directly and clearly. The money was a donation, not a debt. It had no conditions. If Kyle wanted to call it something else in his own internal accounting, that was between him and whatever version of a ledger he kept. She signed the lease on the building on a Tuesday morning in late May. The building was on 67th Street, 2 blocks from the community center, in a space that had been a dental office, and before that a small restaurant, and it had good natural light and a waiting area that was exactly the right size and a back corridor that would convert to exam rooms without much structural work. She stood in it alone the first morning with the keys in her hand and the smell of old building and possibility, and thought about her grandmother, who had gotten her through nursing school and who had made quilts in blues and grays and who had told her once, when she was 19 and exhausted and doubting everything, that care was not a talent you either had or didn't have. Care was a practice. You got up and you did it again the next day. That was the whole of it. She stood in the empty building and said out loud to no one, "I found somewhere to put it." The first staff meeting was the following week. 3 nurses she'd recruited from Mercy Heights who were tired of the ER system and wanted something more direct. A physician's assistant named Reyes, who had been running a mobile clinic out of a van for 2 years, and who cried briefly when he saw the space, and then was very professional about the fact that he had just cried. A receptionist named Gloria, who was 63 and had been working in community health since before Talia was born, and who looked at everything with the assessment of someone who had seen many promising things fail and was withholding judgment until she saw otherwise. Talia stood in front of them and said, "This clinic operates on one principle. Nobody gets turned away. Not for money, not for documentation, not for anything. We figure out how to make it work on the back end and the patient doesn't feel that." She looked at each of them. "Any questions?" Reyes said, "When do we start?" 2 weeks, she said. "The permit's clear Thursday. We start seeing patients 2 weeks from Monday." Gloria said, "Who's the funding source?" "A health nonprofit. Anonymous donor." Gloria looked at her. The look had seen things. "Anonymous." "Anonymous," Talia confirmed. Gloria held the look for another moment and then wrote something in her notepad and moved on, which was the professional equivalent of a decision to trust someone and see where it went. Cale came to see the building that evening after the staff meeting. She let him in with her spare key. She had given him a spare key to the clinic the same week she had stopped pretending that the South Loop apartment was a place she visited rather than a place she lived, a transition that had occurred gradually and without announcement, the way most true things occurred. He stood in the empty waiting room and turned slowly, taking in the light and the space and the new paint on the walls that smelled like beginning. "Well," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The waiting room needs better chairs," he said. "I have a furniture delivery Thursday. The lighting in the corridor is too warm. Exam rooms need cooler spectrum." "Noted. I'll change the bulbs." He turned and looked at her. "You need a good coffee maker. Patients wait better with coffee." "Are you offering to source a coffee maker?" "I'm observing a need." She put her hand over her face briefly. "There will be a coffee maker by Monday," she said into her palm. "Thank you. You're welcome." He walked slowly toward the corridor that would be the exam rooms, looking at each space with the specific attention he brought to systems. She followed. They walked the length of the building in the late evening light, her reading it through a clinical lens, him reading it through whatever structural architecture he assessed spaces with. And she realized they were doing the same thing they had done in the warehouse, or at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, or on every late-night phone call for the past 4 months, working, together, in parallel, toward a shared thing. At the end of the corridor, he turned and leaned against the wall and looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." The almost smile, more itself than almost these days. "I'm looking at you." "I can see that." "You built this," he said. "We built it." "You built this?" he said again, not correcting her so much as being precise. "I funded it. That's not the same thing." He held her gaze. "The dream was yours. The work is yours. The people who are going to walk through that door and get help they couldn't afford, that is yours." She held his gaze. "Kael?" "Yes. Don't make me cry in my own clinic." The smile that moved through his face then was not an almost smile. It was the full version, the one she had been watching approach from a distance since February. And it was, as she had always suspected it would be, entirely devastating. "Okay," he said. She crossed the corridor and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the empty exam room corridor of a free clinic on 67th Street in the south side of Chicago on a Tuesday evening in late May, and neither of them said anything. Outside, the city was moving. The elevated train, sirens in the middle distance, kids in the street, their voices carrying through the walls. The specific percussion of a neighborhood that was living its life, complicated and persistent and entirely indifferent to the particular small moment occurring inside one building on one block. She felt his chin come to rest on top of her head. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, "for the structure, for the work I've been doing." He was quiet for a moment. "The distributed model is more stable. It runs with less of me at the center, which means—" He stopped. "Which means you have a choice," she said into his chest. "Yes." "About what you want it to look like, going forward." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "About whether you want to keep building the thing you've been building or build something different." He looked at her. "I don't know what different looks like." "No," she said. "You don't. Not yet." She held his gaze. "That's what's next. Figuring out what different looks like." She paused. "But you don't have to figure it out alone." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "That is still new." "I know it's new." "I'm not—" He stopped. Started again with the visible effort of someone choosing the honest word over the managed one. "I'm not easy to be with. I have a structure of habits that aren't built for this, for any of this." He gestured, a small movement that encompassed the corridor and the clinic, and by extension everything outside it. "I will fail at things you need. I will default to managing instead of asking. I will be difficult in ways that are not always—" "Kael," she said. "Yes. I have been watching you fail at things and correct them for 4 months. I know what that looks like." She held his eyes. "I am not asking you to be someone without history. I'm asking you to be someone who shows up." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation, no qualification, just the word, flat and honest and entirely certain in the way of someone who has decided a thing and means it. "Then we're fine," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's sufficient for you. That's sufficient." She tilted her head. "Also, you're learning to ask for things instead of just acquiring them, which is frankly enormous progress, and I want it on the record that I noticed." The smile again. She was going to spend a long time cataloging the specific variations of it. "It's on the record," he said.
She stepped back and looked at the corridor. At the exam rooms waiting to be equipped, the paint still fresh, the whole mechanism of it still in the moment before it became what it was going to become. She thought about everyone who was going to walk through the front door, the ones without insurance, the ones who had been putting off a symptom for 6 months because they couldn't afford to know what it was, the kids with ear infections and the elderly with unmanaged hypertension and the pregnant women without prenatal care and every specific human being that the system's gap swallowed and that this building, this narrow building on 67th Street, was going to try to catch. She thought about Marcus Webb, the one she'd lost in November, the one with 4 kids and photographs in his pocket. She thought about what it meant to not be able to save someone. She had spent 14 years learning to live with that math, the gap between trying and succeeding, the patients who didn't make it regardless of what you brought to the room. She thought about Kyle Hahn, collapsed against the wall of a pharmacy on a night she could still feel in her hands, the cold of him, the faintness of a pulse that was losing the argument with temperature. She thought about the choice she'd made to not walk past. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she had cataloged over 4 months, full, unhurried, present in a way that required no performance. The man who had been dying in the snow, the man who had sent a coat and fixed a streetlight because he didn't have the language for thank you, the man who had sat across from her in a bare apartment and dismantled every wall he'd ever built, brick by brick, because she asked him to. He was not a good man in the simple sense. She had never required that. He was a man who had made his choices in a world that offered narrow options and had lived with the cost of them, and was now standing in the corridor of a free clinic on the South Side, trying to figure out what it meant to build something that didn't require anyone to be afraid. That was not small. That was not nothing. "Come on," she said. "Help me figure out where the coffee maker goes." He pushed off the wall. "Near the entrance," he said immediately. "Patients should encounter it before they encounter paperwork." She considered this. "That's actually correct." "I know. You don't have to sound pleased about it." "I'm not pleased. I'm accurate." She walked ahead of him back to the waiting room, and she heard him follow, and the sound of his footsteps behind her in the empty building was the specific sound of a thing that had survived its own worst possibility and was still moving. Outside, the city was going toward evening. The sky over the South Side had gone the particular gold of late May, the last good light of a long day laying itself out across rooftops and sidewalks and the tops of cars and the faces of people walking home. The elevated train passed 1 block east, its sound moving through the building's bones the way it always had. Would always, the heartbeat of a neighborhood that had been here before either of them and would be here after. Through the front window she could see the street, a woman with a stroller, 2 teenagers on bikes, an old man sitting on the stoop of the building across the way, watching the last of the light do its work. Ordinary life. Continued. Moving forward under its own authority, indifferent and enormous and entirely real. She stood at the window of her clinic and looked at it. Behind her, Kyle was standing in the middle of the waiting room assessing the best position for a coffee maker with the same focused precision he brought to everything, and she thought, this is it. Not the dramatic version, not the warehouse version, not the 4 a.m. version, not any of the versions that required everything of both of them. Just this. The late light and the ordinary street and the man behind her working on the small problem of coffee placement because he had decided that the small problems were worth his attention. That was what it looked like. Care as a practice. Showing up. The next day and the next. She thought about her grandmother, about the quilt in blues and grays that was currently folded on the couch in the South Loop apartment that was now also, quietly and without announcement, her home. She thought about the woman who had taught her that care was not a talent, it was a practice. You got up and you did it again. "Near the window," she said, "so there's light." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "near the window." She turned around. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her the first morning in her kitchen, like the fact of her was something he was still surprised by, still taking in, still unable to fully account for within the framework of everything he'd known before. She recognized that look now. She had learned what it was. It was what a man looked like when he stopped expecting to be alone. She crossed the room to him. "Tomorrow we get the furniture delivery," she said. "Yes. And Thursday, the permit's clear." "Yes." "And 2 weeks from Monday, we start seeing patients." "Yes," he said. He was still looking at her in that way.
And in the meantime, she said, we go home. The word landed between them the way a thing lands when it has finally been called by its correct name, home. The place that existed now in both their coordinates, the apartment with the spare key and the grandmother's quilt, and the crossword puzzle still unfinished on the kitchen table, the place where the coffee was made by whoever woke up first, and the late-night calls had been replaced by late-night actual presence, and the parallel line arrangement across small pieces of furniture had become something else entirely without either of them declaring it. He held out his hand. She took it. They turned off the light in the clinic and walked out into the evening and locked the door behind them. And the street received them the way it received everything, without ceremony, without comment, as part of the continuous ordinary motion of a city that did not pause for private significance. Chicago in the last week of May. The snowmelt long gone. The lake 3 miles east, blue-green in the evening light. The south side spreading out in every direction, complicated and alive. The same neighborhood it had always been, full of the same pressures and possibilities it had always held, full of people making their specific calculations about what they could afford to want. Talia Mercer and Cale Hahn walked down 67th Street in the last of the day's gold light, and neither of them spoke, and the city moved around them, and the clinic stood behind them with its fresh paint and its empty waiting room and its unlocked future, and the quilt was at home, and the coffee maker was yet to be placed, and the work of tomorrow was waiting to be done, and the storm was over. Not because everything had been resolved into something clean, it hadn't. There would be more to navigate, the shape of his world finding its new form. The patients who didn't make it regardless of what she brought to the room. The particular difficulty of two people with deep histories of doing everything alone, learning to share the load without losing the selves that had survived all that solitude. There would be more. But the storm was over in the sense that mattered. They were standing in it together, and neither of them was walking past. That was the whole of it. That was enough.